They were knights of God, sworn to protect pilgrims, yet accused of worshipping demons. Warriors of the cross who ended their lives, chained, tortured, and burned by the very church they had served. Their secret confessions spoke of sins too dark to believe, but were they real, or the whispered inventions of kings and fear? Tonight we journey back 7 centuries, into a world where faith and power collided, and where truth itself was forced to kneel. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, close your eyes, let your thoughts slow, and listen as we begin the story of why the Knights Templar gave false confessions of depravity. In the aftermath of the Crusades, Europe was a land reshaped by faith and warfare, its landscapes dotted with ruined fortresses, abandoned villages, and the echoes of battles long concluded, yet never entirely forgotten. Into this fractured world emerged a brotherhood, unlike any other, men bound by oaths of loyalty, discipline, and devotion, whose armor glimmered white under the sun, a red cross emblazoned upon their tunics. They were the Knights Templar, a monastic order formed to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, yet in time, their presence grew far beyond the immediate necessities of the battlefield. From the scorched plains of the Levant to the cobbled streets of Paris, their reputation traveled silently, carried not on banners or heralds, but on whispers, deeds, and the meticulous execution of a code that blended martial rigor with spiritual purpose. The early Templars were born of a world still consumed by the aftershocks of the First Crusade, where the Holy Land seemed a fragile jewel, constantly threatened by competing armies and local powers. This careful cultivation of trust allowed the Templars to extend their reach far beyond the battlefield. They became financial intermediaries for monarchs, nobles, and the church itself, offering loans, safe deposits, and secure transfer of funds. In a Europe still emerging from the instability of war, where coin could be stolen and letters intercepted, their reliability became legendary. Kings entrusted them with royal treasures. Merchants deposited wealth knowing it would be protected. The Pope relied upon their neutrality and discretion in matters of diplomacy. It was not just gold or silver that they guarded, but secrets, plans of war, movements of armies, political correspondence, and even knowledge of relics considered sacred. Over time, the Templars' influence extended into urban centers, where they established preceptories, administrative hubs where property, finance, and spiritual duties converged. Each preceptory became a node in a sprawling network that connected the farthest reaches of Christendom. Yet, their ascent was not marked by ostentation or spectacle. The Templars moved quietly, their presence known more by their deeds than by their words. They avoided unnecessary entanglements with local populations, maintained rigorous internal discipline, and conducted themselves with a level of decorum that made them enigmatic figures to those outside their order. This silence, deliberate and calculated, became one of their greatest strengths. It allowed them to operate across borders, to intervene in disputes without appearing as conquerors, and to accumulate both wealth and influence without attracting immediate jealousy or alarm. Their reputation became a blend of awe and fear, men who were capable, devout, and incorruptible, yet whose motives remained largely inscrutable to those who observed them from the outside. In addition to their external operations, the Templars were also engaged in the preservation and movement of relics and sacred objects. Chronicles and later historical investigations suggest that they were trusted custodians of items considered holy, fragments of the true cross, sacred texts, and relics of saints. The movement of these items required not only courage and martial skill but an intricate understanding of the political and religious landscape. To transport relics across kingdoms, to negotiate passage, and to maintain secrecy, the knights had to navigate alliances, rivalries, and the sometimes unpredictable ambitions of monarchs and bishops. Their success in this delicate enterprise further reinforced their reputation as men of exceptional discipline and trustworthiness. However, this very accumulation of trust, secrecy, and influence would eventually attract scrutiny and envy. Kings saw their independence as a threat, while nobles and merchants grew wary of the Order's growing control over financial and logistical networks. The Templars' ability to operate across borders, their apparent immunity from local authority, and their accumulation of wealth that was unmatched in Europe made them both respected and feared. And yet, in this period of ascent, there was little indication that their dedication, discipline, and devotion could be construed as dangerous. For the moment, their world remained one of measured growth, quiet power, and carefully earned reputation. The culmination of this period was not marked by a single battle or proclamation, but by the subtle weaving of influence across kingdoms. By the early 14th century, the Templars had become an invisible spine of Christendom, a network of warriors, financiers, and custodians whose power was largely unchallenged because it was so quietly exercised. Their white mantles and red crosses became symbols not just of piety, but of reliability, secrecy, and influence. And yet, in the very quiet of their rise, the seeds of envy and suspicion had begun to take root among the secular rulers of Europe, particularly those who were in debt to the Order, or whose authority was subtly challenged by its reach. The same silence and discipline that had allowed the Templars to expand unimpeded now rendered them vulnerable to the perception of secrecy and danger. It was in this delicate intersection of faith, influence, and secrecy that the Templars' story took a darker turn. The very traits that had allowed them to ascend, their discipline, their internal cohesion, their mysterious authority, and the reverence in which they were held, became the lens through which suspicion and envy could distort their image. The chronicles of the time hint at growing murmurs of unease, whispers in royal courts, anxious letters to the Pope, and rumors that would eventually be manipulated by kings seeking both power and financial gain. Though the Order remained outwardly devoted and disciplined, the forces gathering against them would soon exploit perception as effectively as they had once cultivated trust. And it was precisely this growing tension between silent authority and the envy of rulers that set the stage for the next chapter of their story, a period where wealth, faith, and power would collide violently, drawing the Templars into a confrontation with forces that no martial skill or moral authority could withstand, marking the beginning of their fateful undoing under the shadow of King Philip IV and the papacy. The knights who had once guarded pilgrims in the arid deserts of the Holy Land now found themselves wielding a different kind of power, one that did not depend on the swing of a sword or the charge of a cavalry. Their influence had quietly expanded into the very arteries of European wealth and finance, and though they remained cloaked in the outward simplicity of monastic life, behind the stone walls of cathedrals, castles, and fortified preceptories, they held sway over fortunes that shaped the decisions of kings and the ambitions of princes. Their role was no longer merely protective, it had grown into the delicate administration of credit, currency, and trust, a vast network that connected monarchies, trade routes, and ecclesiastical authority in a lattice invisible to those outside the Order. At the heart of this transformation was the Templars' ability to combine martial discipline with financial acumen. Whereas other knights relied on inheritance, plunder, or patronage for sustenance, the Templars developed systems that allowed them to receive deposits of gold, manage accounts across kingdoms, and facilitate transfers that in some ways resembled the banking practices of centuries later. Kings, often deeply indebted from military campaigns or the costs of maintaining courtly grandeur, turned to the Order as a lender of last resort. Nobles, wary of theft and banditry, entrusted their treasures to Templar preceptories, confident that the combination of heavily fortified compounds and sworn incorruptible knights provided an unparalleled guarantee of security. The Order's influence, though largely unspoken, flowed silently through these exchanges, becoming the unseen backbone of Christendom's economy. The very architecture of their power contributed to its subtlety. Preceptories were built strategically across Europe, often in proximity to major trade centers, river crossings, or pilgrimage routes. Within these stone walls, ledgers were maintained, treasures stored, and instructions carried out with precision. Knights, while still observing vows of prayer and fasting, were trained in methods of accounting, property management, and diplomacy. They could negotiate contracts with local lords, adjudicate disputes over land, and oversee complex logistical operations, all while maintaining the outward appearance of devout humility. The combination of military discipline and administrative skill created a class of individuals uniquely suited to wield influence quietly yet decisively. Their reputation for honesty and neutrality was central to their expanding role. Unlike other financial agents who might be swayed by personal gain or political allegiance, the Templars were perceived as bound to a higher moral and spiritual code. This perception allowed them to operate across borders in ways few could match. A French merchant could entrust goods to the order for delivery to the Levant without fear of interference. A king in debt could secure a loan knowing that the knight's obligations were sworn under both martial and divine authority. In these transactions, the Templars' wealth and trustworthiness became mutually reinforcing. Their growing resources increased their ability to lend and protect, while their careful management of assets enhanced the perception of incorruptibility, drawing even greater deposits and influence. Yet, with wealth came subtle complications. The accumulation of gold, land, and influence did not go unnoticed. While the order outwardly adhered to vows of poverty for individual knights, the collective resources they controlled were vast, encompassing castles, farms, vineyards, and even entire villages. Taxes and rents from these holdings flowed to the central treasury of the order, enabling the funding of military campaigns, fortification projects, and charitable works. But this wealth also drew envy and suspicion, particularly from rulers whose own treasuries were strained. The Templars' ability to operate independently of secular authority, to hold wealth in a manner inaccessible to kings and nobles alike, planted the seeds of unease that would later be exploited with devastating effect. Their influence was not confined to finances alone. By virtue of their international network, the Templars became indispensable in matters of diplomacy and communication. Messages, documents, and instructions could be transmitted across kingdoms with relative security, their neutrality and reputation for discretion ensuring that correspondence reached its destination unaltered. In some instances, monarchs relied upon the order to mediate disputes or convey sensitive information, trusting that the knights would uphold both the letter and the spirit of their obligations. In this way, the Templars' presence was felt not only in treasure chests and ledgers but also in decisions made behind the closed doors of palaces and bishoprics. Religious influence remained intertwined with financial and political power. The Templars' role as warrior monks imbued their actions with spiritual authority, reinforcing the trust of those who engaged with them. Their presence at key religious ceremonies, their custody of relics, and their participation in pilgrimages and crusades lent moral weight to their financial dealings. Those who borrowed or deposited funds with the order often did so not merely with an eye toward profit or security, but also in recognition of the Templars' spiritual legitimacy. This combination of wealth and faith rendered their position exceptional. They were simultaneously feared, respected, and relied upon across the kingdoms of Europe. Yet the very factors that cemented their prominence also exposed them to danger. Wealth attracts attention, and independence invites scrutiny. The Templars' holdings were extensive, their accounts meticulous but opaque to outsiders, and their loyalty, while absolute to the order, was viewed with growing suspicion by rulers who had reason to covet their resources. In France, King Philip IV, burdened by debts and facing political pressure, began to see the order not merely as allies or neutral intermediaries, but as obstacles and potential sources of income. What had once been quiet influence became, in the eyes of the crown, a network of untapped wealth and a challenge to royal authority. This tension between quiet authority and the envy of kings marked the threshold of the order's transformation from silent power to a target of unprecedented scrutiny. The very traits that had allowed the Templars to operate securely, discretion, discipline, international networks, and immense resources, became, paradoxically, the tools through which their enemies would manipulate their downfall. Wealth that had once commanded respect now sparked accusation. Influence that had once inspired trust now invited suspicion, secrecy that had once been protection now appeared as conspiracy. And so, while the knights continued to manage accounts, guard treasures, and uphold their vows, an unseen pressure began to gather in the courts of France. The king's advisors whispered of debts owed, of independence that could not be tolerated, and of the potential for accusations that could justify both confiscation of assets and the elimination of a powerful, autonomous institution. It was within this convergence of wealth, faith, and political ambition that the stage was set for the next chapter, a calculated move by monarchs and the papacy that would transform legendary guardians of Christendom into accused heretics, setting into motion the events that would culminate in arrests, interrogations, and the coerced confessions that would forever mark the Templars' history. The quiet grandeur of the French royal palace concealed more than gold and tapestries. It concealed ambition, desperation, and a carefully nurtured resentment that had taken root over years of financial strain. King Philip IV, known in history as Philip the Fair, was a ruler of immense pride and an unyielding temperament, yet beneath the polished veneer of his reign lay burdens that weighed heavily upon the crown. Wars, the maintenance of courtly splendor, and intricate diplomatic obligations had drained the royal coffers, and the king's debts to the Knights Templar, once a convenient source of loans, had begun to grow intolerable. The very institution that had once served as a discreet facilitator of his ambitions now appeared as a rival power, one that held both the king's money, and perhaps more perilously, a degree of influence that no monarch could ignore. Philip's perception of the Templars was shaped not only by financial necessity, but also by the subtle, pervasive aura of their autonomy. While other subjects answered directly to the crown, the Templars operated across borders, with properties, personnel, and influence that were largely independent of royal oversight. Their allegiance was formally to the Pope, but practically, they maintained a network that spanned kingdoms, fortified cities, and controlled significant resources. From Philip's perspective, this independence was unsettling. Here were men who owed him no fealty beyond formal obligations, whose loyalty was to an institution larger and more disciplined than any single kingdom, whose wealth rivaled that of the crown itself. The very qualities that had made them indispensable in matters of finance and diplomacy now marked them as potential adversaries in the calculus of power. The chambers of the king became the incubator of a plan both subtle and ruthless. Advisors, clerics, and financial ministers gathered in hushed consultations, aware that any overt confrontation with the order could provoke political backlash or even military response. Instead, the strategy relied upon shadows, insinuation, rumor, and the manipulation of perception. The Templars' wealth, their discipline, and the secretive nature of their operations were reframed in the king's mind, and in the minds of those he influenced, as signs of hubris and potential heresy. In the quiet of night, away from the prying eyes of subjects and foreign envoys, Philip allowed his envy and ambition to crystallize into intent. The idea was no longer to manage the Templars or coexist with their authority, but to subvert it, to dismantle it, and to claim their vast holdings for the crown. This transformation of perception was aided by the murmurings of those who envied or feared the Templars. Nobles burdened by debt to the order, merchants wary of their financial influence, and even some clerics who resented the knights' independence contributed to a growing narrative that the Templars were not merely financiers or protectors but conspirators in their own right, men who wielded secret power for purposes unknown and possibly profane. In the absence of concrete evidence, imagination and accusation intertwined, creating a tapestry of suspicion that would later serve as justification for the king's actions. Rumor, once trivial, became a tool. Fear, once marginal, became leverage. Philip's approach was both calculated and patient. He understood that a direct attack would be politically dangerous, potentially prompting resistance from other monarchs or from the papacy. Instead, he sought to manipulate the very instruments of authority that had once protected the knights. By quietly lobbying the Pope, cultivating allies within the Church, and engineering a climate in which accusations could take root without immediate rebuttal, the king prepared the groundwork for a coordinated strike. This strategy was not born of mere greed, it was entwined with the insecurities of a ruler whose crown depended upon both perception and power. To neutralize the Templars was to resolve not only financial strain but also the threat posed by a disciplined, independent, and wealthy institution that existed beyond the immediate reach of the crown. The Templars themselves remained largely unaware of the growing storm. Their preceptories continued to function, ledgers balanced, treasure secured, and correspondence maintained across Europe and the Levant. The knights, trained to navigate conflict and diplomacy alike, likely assumed that their status as servants of the church would protect them from the overt ambitions of secular rulers. They were accustomed to the ebb and flow of royal favor, to occasional disputes over land or privileges, and to the jealousies that accompanied their visibility and wealth. Yet the subtle convergence of envy, debt, and political calculation in the palace of Philip IV represented a threat unlike any they had encountered, one in which the machinery of accusation would be deployed with surgical precision, where perception would substitute for evidence, and where the instruments of state would be turned against those who had once been indispensable allies. The tension between the crown and the order was exacerbated by Philip's personal characteristics. Historical records describe him as meticulous, shrewd, and at times ruthless, with an instinct for manipulating both ecclesiastical and secular channels to his advantage. His understanding of law, papal politics, and the levers of influence allowed him to exploit the knights' autonomy without immediate confrontation. By cultivating allies in the papacy, particularly Pope Clement V, and by shaping the narrative through advisors and clerics loyal to the crown, Philip prepared a scenario in which the Templars could be accused, arrested, and neutralized with the appearance of legality. The king's envy and ambition, combined with political savvy, would culminate in one of the most famous and consequential actions in medieval European history, the arrest of the Templars and the extraction of confessions that would forever alter their legacy. Yet even as these plans took form, there was a fragile tension underlying the king's strategy. While he sought to dismantle the order, he had to ensure that the papacy did not openly oppose him, that other monarchs remained neutral, and that the church's authority appeared untainted by his manipulations. This delicate balance of power required both patience and precision. Letters were drafted, envoys dispatched, and rumors seeded carefully in corridors and courts. Every move was calculated to create the perception that the Templars were both suspect and vulnerable, while simultaneously positioning the king as a dutiful guardian of faith and justice. And so, in the quiet chambers of the French palace, a transformation occurred. The knights who had once represented protection, discipline, and spiritual authority became, in the eyes of Philip IV, a threat defined by their wealth, independence, and silent influence. This shadow of envy, combined with the king's political ambition, would soon catalyze the creation of charges, accusations, and mechanisms of coercion that would test the very limits of human resilience and moral fortitude. It was within this web of envy, calculation, and perceived necessity that the Templars' fate would begin to be sealed, as the interplay between crown and papacy set the stage for the dramatic confrontations to come. And as Philip plotted within the gilded halls of Paris, the fragile alliance between the French crown and the papacy began to strain, foreshadowing the next chapter of the Templars' story, the delicate and dangerous relationship between King Philip IV, Pope Clement V, and the order itself, which would determine whether accusations could be transformed into action, and whether the silent power of the knights could survive the scrutiny of a world poised to turn against them. The relationship between the papacy and the French crown had long been one of delicate negotiation, tempered by overlapping spheres of influence and the subtle assertion of authority that defined medieval Christendom. Pope Clement V, who had ascended to the papal throne in 1305, found himself navigating a landscape fraught with political ambition, ecclesiastical expectation, and the personal pressures of a monarchy determined to assert its influence over church affairs. While Rome's gaze traditionally looked east, toward the Crusader states and the Holy Lands that remained a focal point of papal concern. Paris increasingly demanded attention, pressing the Pope to balance spiritual duties with the practical and often coercive ambitions of a king whose temper and resourcefulness were widely recognized. It was in this tension that the Templars' fate would begin to crystallize, caught between the weight of papal authority and the unrelenting designs of a secular monarch. Clement V, a Frenchman by birth, was no stranger to the complexities of French politics. Yet his papacy was immediately marked by the necessity to negotiate carefully with Philip IV, whose court was both influential and insistent in its demands. The Pope's relocation to Avignon, a few years later, would come to symbolize the delicate balance of power that defined his reign, a papacy closely aligned with, and at times constrained by, the French crown. Even before this relocation, the early years of Clement's pontificate were characterized by subtle diplomacy, careful alliances, and an acute awareness of the precarious position in which he found himself. The Church required obedience from the faithful, yet its leader was navigating the ambitions of kings whose proximity to Rome and to the papacy's interests could not be ignored. Within this context, the Templars occupied a unique and complicated position. Their independence from local secular authority, coupled with their wealth, international presence, and military capability, made them a potentially destabilizing force in the eyes of a king determined to assert dominance. For Philip IV, the Templars' power was not only an economic concern but a political challenge. For Clement V, they were a canonical institution, sworn to obedience under the Church and theoretically immune to outright accusations without due investigation. The resulting dynamic was fragile. Any misstep, any appearance of overreach by the king, could provoke a papal response that might compromise the crown's objectives. Conversely, any hesitation or perceived weakness on the part of the Pope could embolden Philip's ambitions, risking the assertion of secular authority over spiritual mandates. The rift between the papacy and the crown did not emerge suddenly. It was a slow accumulation of pressure, suspicion, and negotiation. Philip's debts, combined with his perception of Templar overreach, created the impetus for a campaign that relied upon papal compliance, or at least papal acquiescence. The king's strategy was to frame the Templars not merely as independent operators, but as potential heretics, men whose secretive practices and immense resources could be construed as threats to both temporal and spiritual order. By carefully cultivating rumors, presenting selective evidence, and emphasizing the order's alleged improprieties, Philip sought to create a scenario in which the Pope's cooperation would seem both necessary and justified. Clement, aware of the Templars' reputation and the potential ramifications of royal pressure, faced a dilemma. An outright refusal to engage with the accusations risked confrontation with a powerful monarch, yet blind acceptance of charges could compromise the integrity of the Church and its moral authority. Historical records suggest that the Pope initially approached the matter with caution, commissioning inquiries, requesting reports, and seeking corroboration before issuing definitive judgment. This measured approach reflects the tension inherent in the papal role to uphold ecclesiastical justice while navigating the political realities imposed by secular power. The fragile alliance between Pope and King was further complicated by the internal dynamics of the Church. Clerics and advisors within the papal court were themselves influenced by political considerations, personal ambitions, and the prevailing currents of rumor and fear surrounding the Templars. The order's independence and wealth made them both valuable and suspect, and in the eyes of some ecclesiastical actors, accusations of heresy could be manipulated to resolve both political and financial pressures. In this way, the Templars became enmeshed in a complex web of power, trust, and perception, wherein truth was often subordinate to expediency and survival. Communication between Rome and Paris during this period reflected both the subtlety and the urgency of the negotiations. Letters, envoys, and missives were dispatched to clarify, persuade, and sometimes pressure. reflecting the intricate dance required to maintain the appearance of papal authority while addressing the practical concerns of the French crown. Each exchange carried weight. A poorly worded letter could embolden the king, a delayed response could be interpreted as indecision, and a misjudged inquiry could undermine the Church's credibility. The Templars, largely unaware of these behind-the-scenes deliberations, continued their operations, their silence and discipline making them both admirable and, ironically, more vulnerable to accusations that relied upon perception rather than direct evidence. As the rift widened, the stage was set for the first coordinated interventions against the order. The combination of royal ambition, papal caution, and widespread suspicion created a climate in which even minor rumors could be magnified into charges of heresy, depravity, or misconduct. The Templars' wealth and independence, previously sources of admiration and utility, were now reframed as evidence of potential corruption and moral danger. In the delicate interplay between crown and church, the knights' very virtues, discipline, secrecy, and international reach, were recast as vulnerabilities, leaving them exposed to mechanisms of accusation that would soon be executed with ruthless efficiency. It is within this tension between papal authority, royal ambition, and the order's own disciplined autonomy that the narrative of the Templars' downfall begins to take shape. The fragility of alliances, the subtle pressures of perception, and the convergence of financial, spiritual, and political motives created a situation ripe for exploitation. The stage was set for rumors to solidify into formal charges, for investigations to move from inquiry to accusation, and for the mechanisms of coercion and interrogation to emerge as tools that would test the limits of human endurance and fidelity. Thus, as the fragile threads between Clement V and Philip IV stretched taut, the Templars remained unaware of the storm that approached. Their silence, discipline, and commitment to their oaths, once sources of strength, would soon confront the machinery of suspicion, manipulation, and power politics, setting the stage for the next chapter of their story, the pretexts, rumors, and dossiers carefully constructed against them, which would serve as the foundation for the accusations that led to their arrest and the eventual coerced confessions of depravity. In the delicate interplay of power that defined early 14th century Europe, fear was a force more potent than armies, more persuasive than decrees, and more enduring than the walls of the grandest fortresses. Across towns, villages, and cities, from the bustling markets of Paris to the remote countryside of Provence, whispers began to circulate. These murmurs were subtle at first, passing from one hesitant voice to another, shaping perceptions through ambiguity rather than direct evidence. Tales of secret rites, clandestine gatherings, and forbidden rituals began to attach themselves to the name of the Knights Templar. Their disciplined silence, previously a symbol of devotion and trustworthiness, now became a source of suspicion, a canvas onto which the imagination of a concerned and increasingly anxious public could project fears of depravity and heresy. The origins of these rumors were as elusive as the shadows in which they traveled. Some were no more than distortions of fact, misinterpretations of the order's ascetic practices or martial training. Others were carefully seeded by agents acting on behalf of those who sought the Templars' wealth and influence, including advisors to King Philip V. Political calculation intertwined with public imagination. Stories of secret ceremonies, bizarre punishments, and idolatry began to circulate in courts and towns alike, reinforced by the innate human inclination to fill gaps in understanding with speculation. As the tales grew in repetition and vividness, they gained weight and credibility, not necessarily because they were true, but because the repetition lent them a sense of inevitability. The whispers themselves were varied in content and tone. Some suggested that the knights engaged in acts of blasphemy, turning sacred oaths into rites of mockery. Others hinted at sexual depravity, the inversion of Christian practices, or the veneration of strange, grotesque idols. Although these claims lacked substantiation, their resonance with the anxieties of the age made them compelling. The early 1300s were a period of intense religious devotion, yet simultaneously a period deeply conscious of sin, heresy, and divine judgment. In such a climate, Even the suggestion that men so closely tied to the church might harbor corrupt intentions could provoke fear, moral outrage, and the desire for preventative action. These rumors did not spread uniformly. In regions where the Templars had been visible participants in local defense, charity, or administration, skepticism and even admiration tempered suspicion. Yet in places where their presence was less understood, where preceptories were remote and inaccessible, the imagination had freer rein. Merchants who feared the order's financial influence, peasants who misunderstood the knight's austere customs, and local clerics wary of an institution that answered more directly to Rome than to themselves, all contributed to the amplification of rumor. In this way, fear became both a social and political instrument, an invisible force that could manipulate perception and shape narratives even before any formal accusation was laid. King Philip IV's court became the epicenter from which these whispers radiated. By framing the Templars as morally suspect, politically independent, and potentially dangerous, the king transformed rumor into strategy. Advisors were instructed, implicitly or explicitly, to circulate allegations in ways that could not easily be dismissed. Selective reports, testimonies from coerced or incentivized individuals, and carefully constructed narratives created the impression of widespread misconduct. The effect was cumulative. Even those who had previously respected or trusted the knights began to regard them with caution, anxiety, or outright fear. In this atmosphere, perception often outweighed reality, and the Templars' reputation for discipline and piety became entwined with a growing mythology of impropriety. The dissemination of these rumors was aided by the very networks that had once amplified the order's authority. Their presence in towns, villages, and preceptories, along with the daily interactions of knights, servants, and clerical staff, created opportunities for observation and interpretation. Actions that were benign or dutiful could be misconstrued, ritualized practices could be sensationalized, and the knight's disciplined behavior could appear rigid or secretive to the uninitiated. Thus, the very transparency that came from routine administration was ironically transformed into fuel for suspicion, illustrating how perception and narrative could diverge sharply from fact when fear and ambition intersected. As the stories spread, their impact was magnified by the broader political and religious context. In a Europe acutely sensitive to heresy, unorthodox behavior, and moral corruption, the suggestion of Templar depravity carried profound implications. It was no longer sufficient for the knights to be virtuous or disciplined. Perception of guilt, however unfounded, could invoke investigation, censure, or even violent intervention. The rumors created a climate in which action against the order could be framed as both necessary and morally justified, paving the way for the king to engage in a systematic campaign of accusation and arrest while maintaining the appearance of legality and piety. Moreover, the interplay between rumor and institutional authority reinforced itself. Local authorities, increasingly exposed to stories of Templar misconduct, reported concerns to higher officials, creating an administrative echo chamber in which suspicion was amplified at every level. The repeated circulation of these claims lent them legitimacy, making it possible for accusations to move from whispered speculation to formal charges with remarkable speed. By the time royal decrees were issued, the climate of fear and anticipation had already primed the population to interpret the Templars' silence and discipline as evidence of guilt rather than virtue. It is crucial to understand that the knights themselves were largely unaware of the scale and mechanics of this rumor mill. Their focus remained on prayer, military readiness, and administrative responsibilities. Their silence, discipline, and adherence to vows of obedience and chastity, which had once commanded respect and facilitated trust, now paradoxically rendered them vulnerable to allegations that relied upon secrecy and the human tendency to suspect what is not fully understood. As whispers spread like fog across Europe, the Templars' world, previously defined by control, order, and spiritual authority, became a landscape dominated by perception, speculation, and growing anxiety, both among the public and within the corridors of power. In this charged atmosphere, The stage was set for decisive action. The convergence of fear, envy, and political ambition created an environment in which formal accusations could be prepared and arrests executed with minimal resistance from the populace. What had begun as faint rumors, diffuse and inconsistent, would soon be organized into dossiers, selectively interpreted testimonies, and narratives designed to justify intervention. And so, as whispers thickened into stories and stories into official suspicion, the Templars remained unaware of the network of intrigue forming against them, oblivious to the fact that across Europe, all paths of fear, rumor, and observation were converging on the king's court. This web of speculation and anticipation would soon culminate in a single catastrophic day of arrests, a moment in which the silent authority of the order would be confronted by the machinery of state, forcing them into dungeons, interrogations, and the harrowing ordeal that would produce the confessions which history would remember. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, arrived over France like a grey, oppressive veil, the kind of dawn that seems to compress time and silence the world in anticipation. There was nothing extraordinary to suggest that this day would be remembered in history, yet the air itself carried a tension that would become indelible in the annals of the kingdom. In the quiet of pre-dawn hours, when torches flickered along the narrow streets of Paris and the distant bell of Notre Dame marked the hour, a carefully orchestrated operation moved through the city with precise and unyielding force. Soldiers loyal to King Philip IV, many mounted on horses shrouded in the early mist, approached the fortified preceptories and townhouses where the Knights Templar resided. Their approach was systematic, silent except for the muffled beat of hooves against the cobblestones, yet the implication of that movement was absolute. The arrest of a brotherhood that had for decades commanded influence, respect, and fear throughout Christendom. The Templars themselves, many still asleep or engaged in the quiet rituals of pre-dawn prayer, were unprepared for the swiftness of the strike. Doors, though thick and reinforced, were splintered by force, locks shattered, and gates breached with a combination of battering rams, axes, and coordinated strategy. What had once been a sanctuary and a center of order became, in the span of hours, a scene of chaos and disruption. Scrolls, ledgers, and other documents that contained decades of meticulous records were seized or destroyed. Treasures that had been safeguarded through careful custody vanished into the coffers of the crown. It was an operation designed to neutralize not only the people, but the very structure of the order, removing both its authority and its ability to resist or respond. The scale of the arrests was staggering. Knights were captured across France from Paris to the provinces, in a coordinated effort that revealed the meticulous planning behind Philip IV's strategy. Few had the opportunity to resist. Those who attempted to flee or resist were met with the king's forces, disciplined and determined. Families, servants, and attendants watched helplessly as men they had respected, trusted, or depended upon were forcibly removed from their homes and fortresses. The scene was one of silent terror and awe, a combination of awe at the organization of the king's forces and terror at the suddenness with which the order's autonomy had been destroyed. Despite the suddenness, the operation carried an air of precision that spoke to months if not years of preparation. Intelligence had been gathered meticulously, lists of preceptories, names of knights, and schedules of daily routines had been compiled with care. The king's agents had ensured that no preceptory would be left unaware, no knight spared, and no avenue of escape available. This combination of foresight and ruthlessness illustrates the depth of the threat Philip IV perceived in the Templars, as well as the lengths to which he was willing to go to secure both their wealth and the appearance of moral and legal justification. Once captured, the knights were transported to various detention sites, ranging from city jails to more secure castles and dungeons under direct royal supervision. These sites were chosen both for their security and for their isolation, designed to prevent communication between the order's members and to limit any potential resistance. The atmosphere within these stone walls was thick with uncertainty, fear, and the echoes of what had been a proud, disciplined brotherhood now reduced to individuals in captivity. The knights, trained to face the dangers of battle, now confronted a new kind of adversary, one in which the power of human authority, rumor, and fear eclipsed the clarity of martial skill or moral rectitude. The arrests were accompanied by a deliberate effort to control perception. By seizing records, burning documents, and disrupting the normal operations of the preceptories, the king's forces ensured that both contemporaries and future observers would encounter only fragments of the order's wealth, influence, and internal discipline. The destruction and concealment of these materials created a vacuum that rumor and speculation quickly filled, further reinforcing the narrative of impropriety and secret corruption that had been circulating for months. This deliberate manipulation of evidence was a key element in the king's strategy, ensuring that the public and the church would be inclined to accept the allegations at face value. The psychological impact on the knights was profound. Trained for courage in the face of physical danger, they were unprepared for the methodical application of fear, isolation, and uncertainty. Men accustomed to commanding fortresses and armies now found themselves shackled, transported in chains, and confronted with the unknown. The suddenness of the arrests, combined with the precision and ruthlessness of their execution, created an atmosphere of despair and helplessness. The discipline that had defined the order, previously a source of strength and cohesion, was now tested in the harshest possible terms. Across France, the news of the arrests spread with astonishing speed. Towns, villages, and cities became sites of speculation and rumor as the populace struggled to comprehend the sudden disappearance of a brotherhood that had once been omnipresent yet enigmatic. Markets whispered of heresy, neighbors speculated on secret rites, and the tension in communities mirrored the strategic orchestration unfolding in Paris. The public's imagination, already primed by months of insinuation and rumor, converted uncertainty into certainty, reinforcing the perception of guilt even in the absence of evidence. This day, Friday, October 13, 1307, became a hinge in history, not solely because of the arrests themselves, but because of the transformation they symbolized. The Templars, once a powerful, respected and disciplined order, were now in the grip of the state, subjected to interrogation, isolation and scrutiny. Their wealth had been seized, their authority nullified, and their silence transformed into a liability. The meticulously cultivated image of discipline, loyalty, and spiritual devotion was now reframed as secrecy, fear, and potential guilt. In this single calculated act, the trajectory of an entire institution was altered, its legacy subject to the forces of rumor, coercion, and political ambition. And as the last horseman left the streets, leaving behind the broken doors, smoldering scrolls, and stunned silence of preceptories emptied of their guardians, the Templars were confronted with the beginnings of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but their capacity for resistance in the face of fear, pain, and manipulation. The events of that morning, meticulously orchestrated, would ripple through the dungeons and chambers where knights were held, shaping the confessions, the recantations, and the distorted narratives that history would remember. It was within this atmosphere of calculated terror, isolation, and uncertainty that the next chapter unfolded, the stark and oppressive environment of the dungeons, where the human mind would begin to bend under the weight of coercion, interrogation, and unrelenting fear. Beneath the gilded halls and echoing corridors of the royal palace, in a labyrinth of stone chambers designed for containment and secrecy, the Knights Templar found themselves thrust into a realm far removed from the discipline and order that had governed their lives. The dungeons, constructed with thick walls of cold limestone, narrow slit windows, and arched ceilings, were spaces designed not for comfort, but for control. Torches flickered along the walls, casting shadows that danced over iron shackles, heavy doors, and the instruments of restraint that awaited the prisoners. It was here in this subterranean network that the Order, once the guardians of kingdoms and pilgrims alike, encountered a reality in which neither sword nor prayer could guarantee protection, and where the very structure of their discipline became both their identity and their vulnerability. The Templars, accustomed to fortresses, preceptories, and the predictable rhythms of monastic and military life, were suddenly confronted with isolation in its most absolute form. Chambers were cramped, often shared by multiple prisoners, with minimal ventilation and little light beyond the sporadic flare of torches. The air was thick with humidity, and the acrid tang of unwashed stone mingled with the smoke of torches and the metallic scent of chains and iron. The physical discomfort was immediate and unrelenting: floors of cold stone, walls that radiated chill, and the omnipresent clink of shackles as knights were secured in restraints. Every sound, the groan of a hinge, the scrape of iron, the distant echo of footsteps in the corridors, amplified the psychological tension, creating an atmosphere where the mind could be as constricted as the body. Within these dungeons, the instruments of coercion awaited. Racks, designed to stretch and torment, stood alongside iron collars, binding chains and cords for suspension. Each device was crafted with an understanding of human anatomy and the capacity for pain, intended to break resistance, compel obedience, and extract confession. The knights, who had spent decades mastering weapons of war, were now rendered vulnerable before tools they could neither counter nor anticipate. The familiarity of discipline, courage, and order was replaced by a chaos of fear and the constant uncertainty of what each day, each moment might bring. The psychological impact of this confinement cannot be understated. The Templars were trained to endure hardship, to face battle with courage, and to submit to the spiritual discipline of their vows. Yet the dungeons represented an entirely different kind of trial, one in which the body could be confined, the senses assaulted, and the mind manipulated. The uncertainty of interrogation schedules, the unpredictability of the instruments applied, and the constant awareness of surveillance combined to create a state of heightened anxiety. Every prisoner was acutely aware that the very act of resistance, however morally justified, could exacerbate suffering, while every word spoken under duress could be twisted into evidence against them. Historical accounts and later documentation indicate that the methods employed were systematic. Interrogators, often operating under royal orders or sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority, were trained in the subtle arts of coercion. Questions were repeated, phrased in ways designed to confuse or intimidate, and occasionally accompanied by physical measures to ensure compliance. The aim was not merely to punish, but to extract confessions that could be used to justify subsequent trials, property seizure, and the public perception of moral transgression. In this way, the dungeons became both prison and courtroom, with the walls themselves serving as silent witnesses to the psychological engineering underway. Despite the severity of conditions, the Templars' training and discipline provided some measure of internal cohesion. Knights whispered words of prayer, meditated silently, and maintained small rituals to preserve identity and morale. They sought comfort in shared understanding, in recollections of past campaigns, and in the mental reinforcement of vows that had once defined their purpose. Yet even this inner resilience was tested relentlessly. Sleep was frequently interrupted, meals were sparse, and isolation was punctuated by abrupt interrogations designed to destabilize the mind. The tension between faith, reason, and fear became an omnipresent struggle, as the knights attempted to reconcile their inner discipline with the demands of a system designed to erode it. The physical manifestations of coercion were accompanied by an equally potent psychological strategy: the creation of uncertainty and distrust. Prisoners were sometimes isolated from one another, deprived of information about the fate of comrades, and exposed to contradictory messages from interrogators. This method amplified fear and disorientation, making it difficult for even the strongest minds to resist suggestion or maintain confidence in the possibility of fairness or justice. In many cases, knights found themselves doubting not only the intentions of their captors, but the very reality of their situation, as the dungeons became a space in which time, perception, and expectation were manipulated to break resistance. This environment of confinement and fear laid the groundwork for what would become a series of coerced confessions. Under the relentless pressure of interrogation, often combined with the application of physical discomfort or pain, the Templars faced the agonizing choice between enduring suffering or providing testimony, whether true or invented, that might satisfy the demands of their captors. The methods were subtle yet devastating: gentle suggestion, isolation, and intermittent relief were combined with threats, repetition of accusations, and the constant reminder of the king's authority and the weight of ecclesiastical approval. These techniques gradually wore down resistance, illustrating the terrifying power of psychological control when combined with physical confinement and the manipulation of fear. It is within these stone walls, beneath the palace, and beyond the awareness of the wider public, that the Templars' legendary discipline encountered one of its most severe tests. The very virtues that had defined them, loyalty, obedience, courage, and moral conviction, became the focus of manipulation, turned against the men themselves through a carefully calibrated combination of environmental stress, psychological pressure, and physical coercion. The dungeons of Paris, cold, dark, and unyielding, thus became the crucible in which the confessions of depravity, which would later dominate historical memory, were forced into existence. And as days turned into weeks within these subterranean chambers, the boundaries between truth and coercion began to blur. The knights, stripped of autonomy, subjected to relentless interrogation, and engulfed in uncertainty, faced the impossible challenge of preserving both their lives and their honor. The stage was set for a confrontation between human endurance and the machinery of power, an encounter in which perception, fear, and manipulation would intersect to produce statements and confessions that were less a reflection of actual behavior than a response to the overwhelming circumstances of imprisonment and duress. This oppressive environment, suffused with torchlight and shadow, pain and fear, prepared the way for the next chapter, the process by which accusations were formalized, confessions were coerced, and the mechanisms of legal and ecclesiastical authority combined to extract compliance from a brotherhood that had once seemed unassailable. Within these dungeons, the Templars' silence, discipline, and moral authority were gradually transformed into testimony of wrongdoing, setting the stage for the historical narrative that would forever link them with charges of depravity and heresy. Within the oppressive confines of the Parisian dungeons, the days stretched endlessly, each hour indistinguishable from the last, each breath a reminder of confinement and pain. Torches flickered weakly against the cold stone, casting shadows that twisted and elongated, as if the very walls themselves conspired to distort perception. The air was heavy with dampness, the metallic tang of iron, and the unrelenting presence of human suffering. In these conditions, the boundaries of time and reality blurred. Knights accustomed to discipline, structure, and moral clarity found their certainties eroding under the twin pressures of physical torment and psychological manipulation. Pain, once external and surmountable, became an internalized force that seeped into thought, memory, and the fragile core of faith. The instruments of coercion were deployed with meticulous attention to both body and mind. Racks stretched limbs beyond comfort, cords suspended men in excruciating postures, and iron collars or shackles left impressions in skin that would not fade for weeks. Yet the physical torment was only one component of the process. Interrogators, aware of the intricate interplay between fear and cognition, employed strategies that amplified psychological vulnerability. Repetition of accusations, isolation from comrades, and the threat of indefinite confinement created a state in which the knights' minds became as malleable as the flesh that hung in chains. In this environment, survival demanded adaptation, and adaptation blurred the distinction between reality and the narrative imposed by captors. Faith, which had been the cornerstone of the knights' existence, was tested in unprecedented ways. Prayer, meditation, and ritual, tools that had once provided solace and clarity, were disrupted by the unpredictability of torment and the continual presence of human authority enforcing submission. The silence of the dungeons, once a canvas for reflection, became a pressure cooker of fear, expectation, and doubt. Knights who had once drawn strength from conviction found their beliefs challenged not by debate or reason, but by the unrelenting immediacy of pain, deprivation, and the perception of inevitable defeat. Each moment of torment, each whispered threat, subtly undermined certainty, creating cracks in the moral and spiritual armor that had been painstakingly cultivated over years of devotion and discipline. Historical accounts indicate that the process of mental and physical breaking was calibrated to maximize compliance without causing immediate death. Interrogators understood that the goal was confession, not execution, that a coerced statement once obtained could serve as both justification and evidence. Methods alternated between moments of acute physical strain and intervals of psychological pressure, during which knights were left in isolation, uncertain whether the next session would bring relief or further pain. This interplay of hope and dread, expectation and uncertainty, was critical in eroding resistance. A mind subjected to such conditions cannot reliably distinguish between truth and imposed suggestion, and over time, even the most disciplined individual may yield statements that satisfy the tormentor while preserving a fragment of self-preservation. The atmosphere within the dungeons was amplified by social isolation and the fragmentation of the order. Knights were often separated from one another, denied the solidarity that had long been a source of moral support. The absence of trusted comrades heightened vulnerability, as each man confronted torment alone, uncertain of the experiences or fates of others. Communication was limited or distorted, and when interaction occurred, it was often mediated by captors, ensuring that news was incomplete, exaggerated, or threatening. In this way, the process of breaking extended beyond the individual body, shaping perceptions, eroding collective morale, and fostering an environment in which self-doubt and fear became pervasive. The nature of confession under such conditions warrants careful reflection. Statements extracted were rarely straightforward admissions of wrongdoing. They were often the result of sustained psychological and physical pressure, informed by knowledge of what interrogators sought, and shaped by the instinct for survival. Knights facing relentless torment began to provide answers, whether imagined, coerced or distorted, in the hope that compliance might mitigate further suffering. This conflation of truth, suggestion, and self-preservation created confessions that were simultaneously believable, horrifying, and largely disconnected from the knight's actual practices. It was a tragic intersection of human resilience and vulnerability, in which the capacity for endurance was matched by the fragility of perception under duress. The dungeons themselves became a theatre of unrelenting tension. Torches burned unevenly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The soundscape was dominated by the low groans of prisoners, the clink of iron chains, and the occasional sharp command of an interrogator or guard. Silence was never complete. It was punctuated by the constant threat of renewed pain, by uncertainty regarding the next session, and by the echoing knowledge of other chambers where similar torment was unfolding. In this environment, even minor sensory experiences, the smell of damp stone, the touch of cold iron, or the flicker of flame, became markers of endurance and signals of impending crisis, reinforcing a state of chronic anxiety and heightened vulnerability. It was in this interplay of environment, physical coercion, and psychological manipulation that the Templars' fabled discipline was gradually transformed into compliance. Statements emerged that conformed to the narrative desired by the king and sanctioned, implicitly or explicitly, by the papacy. Confessions recounted later in inquisitorial documents included allegations of idolatry, blasphemy, and sexual impropriety, charges that, under normal circumstances, would have been inconsistent with the order's rigorously observed vows and practices. Yet within the dungeons, under the sustained pressure of fear and pain, the knight's capacity to maintain coherence and resist suggestion was stretched to its absolute limit, resulting in declarations that satisfied the demands of survival, while simultaneously fulfilling the political objectives of those orchestrating the arrests. This breaking of mind and body represents a central and haunting element in the story of the Templars' downfall. It demonstrates the power of sustained coercion to reshape human testimony, to convert disciplined resistance into statements of moral and spiritual corruption, and to forge a narrative that would endure long after the knights themselves were gone. The confessions extracted in these dungeons would serve as the foundation for trials, property seizure, and the historical memory of the order, shaping both contemporary perception and centuries of myth and speculation. And as the days and nights continued in that subterranean realm, the knights faced the convergence of fear, endurance, and moral compromise. preparing the stage for the next chapter. The formal documentation of these confessions, the construction of evidence dossiers, and the calculated dissemination of the narrative of depravity that would underpin the Templars' legal and historical fate. Within the confines of stone and shadow, the line between truth and survival had been irrevocably blurred, setting the path toward the next sequence of political and ecclesiastical actions. Within the cold stone chambers of the dungeons, the transformation from silent resistance to written confession unfolded with a deliberate, almost ritualized precision. The knights, subjected to the unrelenting pressures of physical torment and psychological manipulation, began to record their statements under the watchful eyes of scribes and clerical officials. Each parchment became a vessel for the convergence of fear, coercion, and survival instinct. What emerged on these pages was rarely a reflection of lived reality. Instead, it was a document forged in the crucible of human endurance, a testament not to vice but to the overwhelming compulsion to preserve life in the face of unyielding authority. The act of writing a confession was, in itself, a layered experience. Hands that had once wielded swords and administered justice now trembled as quills were pressed to coarse parchment. The ink, thick and uneven, mirrored the instability of thought under duress, smudging in places where the hand shook, hesitated, or trembled with anticipation of further torment. Every word inscribed was measured against the silent threat of additional suffering. Every pause carried the weight of uncertainty and fear. The knights knew that deviation, contradiction, or hesitation could provoke renewed coercion, amplifying both physical pain and the specter of moral judgment. The content of these confessions was shaped almost entirely by the conditions under which they were extracted. Interrogators, operating under the dual authority of the crown and ecclesiastical sanction, guided questioning with meticulous care. Repetition, suggestion, and the presentation of expected answers created a framework in which compliance was both inevitable and compelling. Knights, confronted by this constant pressure, often wrote what was demanded: idolatry, blasphemy, ritualized depravity, not because these acts had occurred, but because the very structure of their environment, the rhythm of torment, and the certainty of further pain dictated acquiescence. The scribes themselves played a subtle but crucial role. In many cases they acted as intermediaries, translating spoken responses into written form, often interpreting ambiguity in ways favorable to those in power. The parchment, once neutral, became an instrument in the machinery of accusation. Each signature, each mark of consent, was more than a simple acknowledgement. It was a calculated surrender, an acknowledgement of the inevitability imposed by circumstance. The physical act of inscription was thus inseparable from the psychological coercion that had preceded it, blending the tangible with the intangible to create a document whose authority derived from both the knight's body and the instruments of control. The dungeon's oppressive atmosphere permeated every line. Torches flickered against the damp stone walls, their light casting moving shadows over trembling hands and parchment surfaces. The air, thick with the odor of iron, sweat, and the occasional scent of charred scrolls from prior confiscations, reinforced a sense of entrapment and futility. Sounds, the clinking of chains, muted cries, and the occasional command from a guard, punctuated the silence of scribal labor, embedding the confessions within a lived experience of terror. In such conditions, the act of writing became both survival strategy and testament to endurance. The words inked upon the pages were less declarations of intent than adaptations to circumstance. Historical records from the subsequent trials illustrate the standardized nature of these documents. Statements repeated recurring themes: the renunciation of Christ, the acknowledgement of forbidden rites, the veneration of mysterious figures, and other claims of moral and spiritual transgression. Yet modern scholarship, based on cross-referencing surviving confessions with independent sources, has revealed that these admissions were heavily influenced by duress. Common elements across confessions suggest not a reflection of uniform behavior, but the imposition of a consistent narrative desired by interrogators and sanctioned by the king's political objectives. The written word, while ostensibly an act of agency, was in fact a conduit for imposed meaning, shaped by the relentless architecture of fear. The process of recording these confessions often extended over days and weeks. Knights were summoned repeatedly, instructed, corrected, and sometimes compelled to revise statements in light of perceived inadequacies or inconsistencies. The parchment became an arena for negotiation between survival and integrity, with each line representing a compromise, each mark a concession. In this painstakingly methodical environment, truth was no longer a matter of lived experience, but a product of endurance, coercion, and the intricate manipulation of authority. Social isolation magnified the impact of this process. Prisoners, unable to consult with comrades or compare notes meaningfully, were left to interpret their circumstances in solitude. Letters were forbidden, conversation monitored, and communal support minimized. In this vacuum, the mental landscape became one in which the knight's own perception of events was gradually reshaped to fit the framework imposed by captors. The act of confession, ostensibly voluntary, became intertwined with a profound need to reconcile suffering with a path toward relief, however uncertain or partial that relief might be. The consequences of these documents extended beyond the immediate confinement of the dungeons. Once signed and sealed, confessions were collected, archived, and integrated into formal dossiers that would underpin trials, legal proceedings, and the broader campaign to delegitimize the Templar order. Each parchment carried weight far beyond the individual prisoner. They became instruments of state power, tools of moral and political authority, and templates for future interrogations. The written words, while individually coerced, collectively created the semblance of widespread complicity, reinforcing the narrative of depravity that the crown and its ecclesiastical allies were eager to establish. Even as the ink dried on trembling hands and the knights were returned to shadowed cells, the psychological impact persisted. The act of confession, though outwardly complete, resonated internally as both relief and despair. Relief in that a temporary cessation of torture might follow, despair in that the recorded words now carried consequences far beyond the dungeon walls. The confessions became both a personal and institutional transformation. The knights themselves had been altered by the act of submission, and the order as a historical and legal entity had been reshaped through documents inked in pain. And so, as the parchments accumulated, the machinery of accusation took tangible form. The confessions once collected would feed directly into trials, property seizures, and the orchestration of narratives designed to justify the eradication of the order's autonomy. Within the dungeons and beyond, the combination of human endurance, coercion, and the carefully constructed legal framework ensured that fear and survival dictated the contours of historical record. The stage was now fully set for the next chapter, the compilation of evidence, the framing of charges, and the deliberate dissemination of the narrative that would transform whispers, rumor, and coerced statements into the enduring legend of Templar depravity. As the ink dried upon trembling hands, and the confessions accumulated in the dimly lit dungeons of Paris, a discernible pattern began to emerge across the statements of the knights. The accusations, once individualized by circumstance and fear, began to take on a uniformity that was striking in both its repetition and its meticulous detail. Denial of Christ, obscene kisses exchanged between initiates, and the worship of a head-shaped idol, the so-called Baphomet, appeared with remarkable consistency across testimonies, creating the illusion of a rehearsed narrative rather than a spontaneous record of individual action. It was a rhythm imposed upon human suffering, a choreography of words shaped not by truth, but by the deliberate mechanisms of interrogation and the human instinct for survival. In the quiet, cold chambers where these statements were penned, the repetition of specific allegations served multiple purposes. From the perspective of the interrogators and the king's court, uniform confessions provided a sense of legitimacy. The appearance of corroboration suggested widespread guilt, and the uniformity of details lent authority to accusations that would otherwise be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. For the knights themselves, the repetition of these charges created a psychological weight. Faced with the impossibility of satisfying the interrogator's expectations through denial, and understanding that deviation could provoke renewed suffering, the prisoner's own perceptions of reality began to bend. Words were selected for expedience rather than fidelity to fact, with each line a careful negotiation between self-preservation and the desire, however faint, to maintain integrity. The mechanisms through which these narratives were imposed were subtle yet relentless. Interrogators, often trained or guided by ecclesiastical advisors, employed methods that combined psychological manipulation with strategic suggestion. Repeated questioning, reinforcement of previously stated confessions, and the deliberate presentation of details that a knight should acknowledge created a framework in which compliance became inevitable. In this environment, even the most disciplined individual found it difficult to distinguish personal memory from the constructed narrative. Statements became a product of circumstance as much as of will, shaped by the cadence of interrogation, the predictability of physical or psychological consequences, and the human capacity for adaptation in the face of relentless pressure. The role of documentation and recording in this process was equally significant. Scribes present in the dungeons to transcribe spoken words often influenced the final content through selective recording, emphasis, or interpretation. A hesitant phrase could be clarified or completed to fit the expected pattern. Ambiguity could be resolved in favor of the narrative being constructed by the authorities. In this sense, the parchment became both witness and participant in the transformation of human endurance into a formalized statement of guilt. What emerged was a set of confessions that bore the appearance of corroboration, yet beneath the surface revealed the profound distortions imposed by fear, coercion, and manipulation. The repetitive nature of the charges, denial of Christ, ritualistic mockery, obscene gestures, and idol worship, also reflects broader societal anxieties of the time. Medieval Europe was deeply attuned to concepts of heresy, blasphemy, and moral corruption. The specific content of the confessions resonated with contemporary fears, rendering the statements more credible in the eyes of the public, clerical authorities, and secular courts. By aligning coerced admissions with existing cultural and religious concerns, the narrative achieved a potency that extended far beyond the immediate dungeons, shaping the perceptions of communities, clergy, and rulers alike. Within the dungeons, the repetition itself became a psychological instrument. Knights, hearing and reading of others' confessions, internalized the patterns as a form of inevitability. Even those who initially resisted suggestion gradually adopted the rhythm of the imposed narrative, understanding that deviation could trigger renewed suffering. The process transformed isolation, observation, and the slow passage of days into a system of behavioral conditioning. In this way, the confessions were not simply statements of experience, they were the culmination of a carefully orchestrated environment in which fear, repetition, and authority conspired to produce uniformity of expression. The standardization of accusations had legal and political consequences as well. Uniform confessions facilitated the creation of official dossiers, letters of indictment, and reports to the papacy and other ecclesiastical authorities. They provided the king's court with a veneer of procedural justice, suggesting that the arrests, imprisonment, and interrogation of the Templars were not arbitrary but grounded in repeated, consistent, and ostensibly voluntary admissions. This bureaucratic formalization transformed the coerced statements into instruments of authority, tools that could justify confiscation of wealth, dissolution of property rights, and the broader suppression of the order. Yet, within the dungeons themselves, the psychological toll remained profound. The repetition of these fabricated acts, combined with ongoing isolation and observation, created a sense of inevitability that compounded physical suffering with existential despair. Knights who had once defined themselves through courage, piety, and loyalty now faced a dual challenge, enduring the ongoing torment of the body, while negotiating the moral and cognitive weight of statements that contradicted their lived reality. The act of confession, performed repeatedly, became both survival strategy and symbolic surrender, reflecting the complex interplay between human resilience and vulnerability. The uniformity of the confessions also influenced subsequent perceptions beyond the immediate contexts. Chroniclers, clerical historians, and later storytellers would encounter these statements as evidence of systemic depravity within the order, rarely appreciating the context of coercion and duress under which they were produced. Over time, the repeated allegations of idolatry, blasphemy, and obscene ritual came to define the Templars' legacy in popular imagination, even as modern historians examining cross-referenced records recognize the role of torture, psychological pressure, and political expedience in shaping these narratives. In essence, the rhythm of accusation imposed in the dungeons became the template for centuries of misunderstanding and myth-making. And so, as the knights continued to write, sign, and seal their statements under observation and coercion, the dungeons of Paris echoed not only with the sounds of suffering but with the insidious construction of a story that would outlast them all. The repetitive nature of the confessions, the carefully curated sequence of alleged crimes ensured that fear, pain, and manipulation translated into an enduring historical record. Within these stone walls, the Templars' discipline, silence, and moral fortitude were transformed into the script of sin, a narrative that would serve both as justification for their suppression and as a foundation for centuries of speculation, legend, and debate. By the time Pope Clement V, seated under the vaulted ceilings of the papal chambers in Avignon, turned his attention to the unfolding crisis of the Knights Templar, the stage had already been meticulously arranged by forces beyond the Holy See's immediate control. The accusations had spread across France like wildfire, fueled by the king's agents, whispered rumors, and the meticulously documented confessions extracted under conditions of extreme duress. For the pontiff, intervention was not merely a matter of spiritual oversight, but a delicate political act, one that required navigating the treacherous currents of royal ambition, ecclesiastical authority, and the complex network of loyalties that extended across Christendom. Yet, despite the Church's authority, the truth that Clement sought was already obscured, tainted by the mechanisms of fear and manipulation that had dominated the dungeons of Paris and the preceptories throughout France. The Templars, transported to ecclesiastical review or interrogated under papal commission, entered the process as men already broken by weeks or months of isolation, physical torment, and psychological coercion. Their minds, frayed by exhaustion and fear, often conveyed statements that conflicted with both one another and with observable reality. In some cases, knights recanted portions of their confessions, seeking to assert their innocence or clarify inaccuracies, but these recantations were received with skepticism. To observers distant from the immediate context of coercion, the broken voices of the knights seemed unreliable, inconsistent, or evasive. The extraction of truth became a task compounded by the very environment in which the confessions had been obtained, a landscape where survival instincts manipulated perception and fear converged to produce statements that were simultaneously admissions and denials, coerced and contradictory. The papal inquiry, though conducted with the authority of the Church, was constrained by political realities. Clement V, himself deeply enmeshed in the pressures exerted by King Philip IV, had to balance spiritual justice with diplomatic pragmatism. France was a dominant power, its king determined to assert control over both property and narrative, and any challenge to Philip's actions risked political fallout that could destabilize broader European alliances. Within this tension, the Pope's interventions were cautious and measured, commissions were appointed, letters were dispatched, and instructions for hearings and investigations were issued. Yet the environment that had produced the confessions, dungeons, coercion, and the systematic imposition of fear remained largely intact, limiting the capacity of the papal process to uncover objective truth. Knights brought before ecclesiastical inquiry were often in states of mental and physical exhaustion. Their previous confessions, already inked upon parchment, had created a framework that inquisitors and clerics found difficult to challenge. Even when statements were partially retracted or corrected, the existence of written confessions paired with the perception of procedural authority lent the accusations an enduring weight. In effect, The process became a negotiation between human frailty and institutional power. The knights' voices, however fractured, were filtered through a system designed to interpret them within pre-existing assumptions of guilt and depravity. The role of memory and perception during these inquiries was particularly fragile. Knights who had endured torture, extended isolation, and deprivation often struggled to recall precise events or to distinguish between imposed suggestions and their own experiences. The repeated questioning, conducted in unfamiliar settings under ecclesiastical supervision, interacted with psychological trauma to produce statements that were inconsistent, fragmented, or compliant with expectations. Clerics tasked with reviewing these testimonies faced a difficult interpretive challenge, discerning whether confessions reflected reality, coercion, or the delicate interplay of both. The subtleties of human endurance and cognitive adaptation were often lost in the formalities of inquiry, leaving the knights' accounts vulnerable to misinterpretation or manipulation. Despite these challenges, the papal inquiry represented the Church's attempt to maintain legitimacy, balance justice, and provide an appearance of procedural fairness. Instructions were given for careful documentation, for verification where possible, and for adherence to canonical norms in interrogation and recording. Yet, even as these measures were undertaken, the broader social and political narrative, shaped by the king's ambitions, public rumor, and the dramatic spectacle of arrest and detention, continued to dominate perception. By the time the papal commissions convened, much of the public and royal narrative had already framed the Templars as morally and spiritually corrupt, making the pursuit of impartial truth a profoundly difficult endeavor. The knights themselves, though speaking with diminished confidence, attempted to navigate these proceedings with the remnants of courage and fidelity that had defined them for decades. Some sought to clarify previous statements, recant fabricated admissions, or emphasize adherence to vows and spiritual discipline. Others, overwhelmed by fatigue and the residual trauma of coercion, offered minimal testimony, seeking only to endure the process with as little additional harm as possible. Yet, even when recantations were offered, the systemic weight of prior confessions, combined with the pressures of political expediency, ensured that the narratives imposed under torture continued to dominate both legal records and public perception. In the shadows of the papal chambers, the profound injustice of the situation became apparent. Men who had once been pillars of martial and spiritual discipline were reduced to fragile, fractured figures whose every word was interpreted against them. The intersection of human endurance, coercion, and institutional authority created an environment in which the line between truth and imposed narrative was irretrievably blurred. Even the Pope, wielding the highest spiritual authority in Christendom, faced the limitations imposed by political necessity, the fragility of testimony under coercion, and the cumulative weight of the documents already inked in the dungeons. By the conclusion of the papal inquiry, the fate of the Templars had been largely sealed. Although some knights managed partial recantations or assertions of innocence, their voices carried little influence against the momentum of prior confessions, royal directives, and public perception. The inquiries, carefully framed and ostensibly impartial, were unable to overcome the pervasive effects of coercion and the strategic orchestration of accusation. The narrative of depravity, once whispered in rumor, formalized in confession, and now reinforced in ecclesiastical review, had become entrenched, guiding both the subsequent trials and the historical memory of the order. And as the inquiry concluded, the Templars remained suspended between their broken past and an uncertain future. Their testimonies, filtered through the machinery of power and institutional authority, had been recorded, catalogued, and utilized to justify actions already underway: property confiscation, legal prosecution, and the orchestration of a narrative designed to legitimize the destruction of an institution that had once wielded immense spiritual, military, and financial influence. The subtle orchestration of coercion, documentation, and ecclesiastical oversight had ensured that the story of the Templars would forever be intertwined with confessions shaped by fear rather than by fact. Thus, the papal inquiry, though ostensibly a search for truth, became another stage in the transformation of the Templars' reality, a process in which silence, discipline, and moral integrity were systematically converted into a narrative of alleged sin. And as these proceedings concluded, the path was laid for the formal condemnation, dissolution, and the enduring legend of an order whose reputation had been irrevocably reshaped by power, fear, and the tragic consequences of coerced testimony. Within the dimly lit chambers of interrogation and imprisonment, a subtle but potent form of negotiation unfolded, one that balanced pain, fear, and the tantalizing prospect of survival. The captors, fully aware of the psychological fragility of the knights, employed a calculated system of incentives and threats, promising relief, leniency, or even life itself to those willing to confess, while painting a starkly different fate for those who resisted. In this climate of extreme duress, the line between truth and survival became not merely blurred, but effectively erased. As knights confronted a singular, pressing question, how much could they endure, and at what cost would they preserve their lives? The promises of mercy were rarely absolute, and their delivery was carefully controlled. Knights were informed, often in the soft, deliberate tones of clerics or interrogators, that a confession would result in protection from the most severe forms of punishment, a transfer to less physically taxing confinement, or the chance of eventual release. These assurances, however, were invariably shadowed by the constant reminder that refusal could invite escalation, torture intensified, isolation prolonged, and death, whether by execution or its slower, more insidious alternatives, loomed as a near certainty. The very atmosphere, thick with the odors of damp stones, sweat, and iron, reinforced the ever-present tension between hope and despair, offering a fragile promise against the ever-looming certainty of suffering. The mechanics of these incentives were carefully integrated into the daily routines of the dungeons. Knights were summoned for questioning, after periods of enforced confinement, often after days or nights of disrupted sleep, hunger, or exposure to cold and dampness. The interrogators would alternate between extreme coercion and fleeting reprieve, creating a rhythm that conditioned the mind to associate compliance with survival. In this environment, the act of confession was transformed into a strategic choice, an adaptive response to circumstances rather than a spontaneous moral decision. Each knight faced the agonizing calculus of determining which statements might suffice to preserve life without wholly betraying conscience or honor. The psychological burden of these choices was profound. Men trained to uphold vows of chastity, loyalty, and devotion were suddenly forced to weigh the preservation of their physical selves against the violation of moral principles cultivated over decades. The act of confession, even when false, became a mechanism to navigate a space in which all options were forms of compromise. Some knights recited accusations in precise formulaic terms, mirroring previous statements or the expectations of interrogators, while others attempted subtle deviations to maintain a personal sense of truth, however tenuous. In every instance, the lines between reality, suggestion, and survival became increasingly indistinct. Historical accounts suggest that the promises of mercy were particularly effective in breaking resistance. For knights who had already endured weeks or months of confinement, torture, and isolation, the prospect of alleviation of suffering, however conditional or temporary, was a powerful motivator. Confession became, in essence, an act of self-preservation, a way to negotiate with the instruments of power that dominated every aspect of the knight's existence. This dynamic underscores the interplay of human endurance, psychological pressure, and coercive authority. Even men of exceptional discipline could be guided, through fear and hope, into articulating statements that satisfied captors while preserving a fragile spark of life. Yet the moral and spiritual consequences of these coerced admissions weighed heavily upon the knights. While the body might find relief in compliance, the mind grappled with the dissonance between actions undertaken for survival and the ethical, religious, and personal codes that had defined their lives. For some, the act of confessing to deeds they had not committed was accompanied by intense guilt, shame, and the fear that the spirit itself might suffer as a result. Others sought solace in rationalization, framing their statements as necessary concessions to preserve life in a universe that had become dominated by human cruelty rather than divine justice. In this manner, the confessions were simultaneously lifelines and burdens, threads that tied existence to submission while corroding the moral autonomy that had once defined the order. The dungeons themselves, with their oppressive architecture of stone, iron, and shadow, amplified the potency of these psychological maneuvers. The sound of dripping water, the echo of distant footsteps, and the intermittent flicker of torchlight created a sensory environment that reinforced the stakes of each decision. Time was distorted, hours blended into days, days into weeks, and the monotony of enforced confinement became a crucible in which patience, hope, and fear coalesced into a singular imperative: survive. Within this crucible, confession became not merely a pragmatic act, but a psychological necessity, an adaptation to a reality in which the very will to live demanded acquiescence. Social dynamics within the dungeons further shaped the process. Information about the experiences of other prisoners, filtered through rumor or controlled communication, influenced perceptions of risk and reward. Knights learned that those who resisted often endured prolonged suffering, while those who confessed, even partially, might receive respite. This observation, repeated across multiple preceptories and detention centers, reinforced the practical calculus of confession as a strategy for survival. The interplay of observation, expectation, and experience created a network of subtle coercion that extended beyond physical instruments, embedding itself in perception and behavior. The interplay of mercy and threat also had institutional significance. By obtaining confessions through a combination of promise and fear, the king and the papal authorities were able to justify subsequent legal and political actions. Property seizures, dissolution of the order, and formal trials were legitimized through documents and statements that were presented as voluntary admissions of guilt, even though they had been forged under extreme duress. In this way, the delicate balance of hope and terror was harnessed not only to preserve lives temporarily, but to construct a framework of authority and control that would shape the historical record. Ultimately, the temptation of mercy highlights the tragic convergence of human endurance, coercive authority, and moral compromise. Knights who had once embodied courage, faith, and discipline found themselves negotiating survival in a landscape dominated by fear, pain, and the strategic use of conditional reprieve. Confessions forged in this environment became both shields against immediate harm and instruments in the broader campaign to dismantle the order's power, reputation, and legacy. And as these decisions accumulated within the confines of stone, shadow, and iron, the knights' actions, coerced, strategic, and morally fraught, laid the groundwork for the subsequent formalization of accusations, the propagation of a narrative of depravity, and the further consolidation of political and ecclesiastical authority. In this delicate interplay of mercy and threat, survival and truth, the Templars' path toward history was being irrevocably shaped, preparing the way for the next chapter, the king's consolidation of narrative power, and the careful orchestration of perception across the realm. In the echoing chambers of both royal and ecclesiastical authority, the confessions of the Templars were treated not as personal statements of experience, but as reflections of a preordained narrative. Each declaration of denial, blasphemy, or ritualized misconduct was meticulously catalogued, cross-referenced, and interpreted to fit the conceptual framework of heresy that dominated medieval thought. The content of the confessions, often absurd, contradictory, and clearly the product of coercion, was nevertheless elevated to the status of evidence, presented as proof that a once revered order had deviated into moral and spiritual corruption. Yet behind these statements lay a profound and tragic pattern. They were less a reflection of actual heretical practices than a mirror of the fears, prejudices, and anxieties of those conducting the interrogations. The Inquisition, the institution tasked with rooting out heresy across Christendom, had developed its own rigid templates for what constituted spiritual deviation. Denial of God, mockery of sacred symbols, and clandestine worship of imagined idols were all emblematic of the archetypal heretic. When applied to the Templars, these templates transformed coerced admissions into a seemingly coherent narrative of moral corruption, even though the individuals confessing had, in reality, maintained their vows and disciplined lives. The process illustrates the interplay between institutional expectation and human endurance. Confessions were not spontaneously aligned with historical reality, but were instead produced to satisfy the perceived criteria of guilt that the interrogators had internalized from broader societal and ecclesiastical anxieties. The repeated emphasis on particular charges, idol worship, obscene gestures, denial of Christ, reveals the extent to which these confessions were shaped by projection rather than observation. Interrogators, operating under a combination of political instruction and doctrinal expectation, sought consistency across testimonies, applying subtle pressure to ensure that each statement mirrored the previous. In this sense, heresy itself became performative. It was not only alleged by the prisoners, but imposed upon them, a constructed narrative to satisfy the fears of those in positions of power. The very language of confession became a tool of authority, converting human vulnerability into a codified script that aligned with pre-existing notions of deviance. The consequences of this manufactured heresy extended far beyond individual knights, or even the immediate legal proceedings. By framing the Templars as morally and spiritually corrupt, the king and papacy were able to justify extraordinary political and financial measures. The order's wealth was seized, its properties redistributed, and its social influence effectively neutralized. What had begun as an exercise in coercion within the dungeons of Paris was transformed into a fully realized narrative of institutional wrongdoing, one that served both as legal justification and as a means of consolidating power over territories, assets, and public perception. The allegations, though largely fictitious, achieved tangible outcomes, demonstrating the devastating efficacy of heresy as both a concept and a weapon. Historians today note the striking uniformity of these patterns across Europe. Whether in France, England, or the Iberian Peninsula, accusations against the Templars echoed the same themes, regardless of local practice or evidence. This consistency underscores the degree to which the narrative of heresy was imposed from above, rather than emerging organically from the actions of the knights themselves. The Templars became in effect a canvas upon which the collective anxieties of church and state were projected, their supposed sins reflecting more the fears of their accusers than any actual moral failing. Within the confines of imprisonment and ongoing observation, the knights internalized the pressures of these imposed patterns. Even those who initially resisted the narrative eventually found themselves compelled to align statements with the expectations of interrogators. The human mind, when subjected to prolonged coercion, repetition, and the oscillation of pain and respite, adapts to survive, often at the cost of truth. This dynamic ensured that heresy, as recorded, became both performative and persuasive, cementing a narrative of deviance that would persist long after the individuals themselves had been silenced. The dungeons, preceptories, and judicial chambers together created an environment in which moral ambiguity was weaponized. Knights faced the impossibility of defending themselves against both physical suffering and the institutionalized expectations of guilt. Even when truth might have been spoken, it was filtered through layers of coercion, interpretation, and preconception, rendering it nearly invisible. The confessions that emerged were not windows into the actual practices of the order, but rather artifacts of manipulation, documents forged in fear, repetition, and strategic compliance. This orchestration of narrative had long-lasting cultural consequences. Over the centuries, the legend of Templar depravity, idolatry, and blasphemy became a staple of European storytelling, codified in chronicles, ecclesiastical records, and popular imagination. The reality that the confessions were largely coerced and aligned with the structural anxieties of authority was obscured by the compelling rhythm and uniformity of the recorded statements. Heresy had become a weapon not merely of law or punishment, but of history itself, shaping the way subsequent generations would understand the rise and fall of the order. The psychological toll on the knights, who endured imprisonment, torture, and the systematic imposition of guilt, cannot be overstated. They were forced to navigate the impossible terrain between physical survival, moral integrity, and institutional expectation. Each confession represented both a strategic act and a moral compromise, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit under conditions designed to destroy it. Yet, even as they struggled to maintain internal coherence, the broader machinery of authority transformed their vulnerability into the appearance of systemic moral collapse. In essence, the heresy that never was highlights the tragic intersection of human endurance, coercion, and institutional fear. The Templars were not corrupt, blasphemous, or idolatrous in practice. Rather, they became vessels for the anxieties, ambitions, and expectations of those who sought to control them. Through a combination of imprisonment, psychological pressure, coerced confession, and legal formalization, the idea of heresy was weaponized, and truth became a casualty. The carefully constructed narrative ensured that the knights' actual lives, discipline, and vows were subsumed beneath the weight of imposed transgression, creating a legacy that would endure for centuries. And as the knights' coerced statements circulated through royal courts, ecclesiastical archives, and public discourse, the stage was set for the next chapter: the manipulation of evidence, the orchestration of trials, and the careful deployment of historical record to ensure that the Templars' fall was absolute, leaving no room for dissent or reinterpretation. The narrative of heresy, once imposed in shadowed dungeons, would now be inscribed into the broader machinery of authority, consolidating power and shaping the memory of an entire order. The first light of dawn fell unevenly over the Gothic spires of Paris, brushing against the stone of Notre Dame, and casting elongated shadows across the cobblestones, where centuries of footsteps had worn a faint path into the city's heart. On that morning, the air was heavy with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the gravity of the events about to unfold. The condemned Templars, once armored knights, whose presence had inspired both fear and respect across Christendom, were now stripped of their symbols of status and power, clad instead in coarse, rough-spun robes that signified their subjugation and impending mortality. Each step toward the pyres was measured and slow, a procession in which human dignity was obscured by ritualized degradation, yet beneath the surface, the weight of centuries of loyalty, discipline, and valor still clung invisibly to the figures moving through the mist. The streets along the procession route bore witness to a strange confluence of ritual and spectacle. Merchants, townspeople, and clergy gathered, some out of morbid curiosity, others drawn by a desire to witness what was framed as justice. The early morning light, refracted across the cathedral's stained glass, illuminating the procession with colors that seemed almost unreal against the starkness of the condemned men and the coals that would soon consume them. In these moments, the contrast between the sacred and the profane was acutely visible. Prayers whispered into the open air, mingled with the acrid scent of kindling, the murmured rhythm of psalms dissolved by the anticipation of smoke and flame. The condemned men themselves moved with a silent gravity that reflected both resignation and reflection. Each knight had endured months of imprisonment, physical torment, and coerced confession, and now faced the culmination of a systematic process designed to strip them of autonomy, honor, and historical voice. The coarse robes, the measured march, and the ritualized separation from companions all functioned to prepare them and the public for the ultimate act of finality. Yet, despite the immediacy of their mortality, the knights carried with them the invisible weight of experience, the strategic endurance that had allowed them to survive dungeons, interrogations, and psychological manipulation now found expression in a solemnity that even fire could not fully erase. As the Templars approached the pyres, the architecture of Paris, the towering stone of Notre Dame, the narrow alleys, the distant hum of the Seine, framed their final moments with a quiet majesty. Flames were prepared, stacked with dry timbers that would catch quickly, ensuring that the execution was both visible and complete. The sensory environment was stark, the scent of smoke, the sound of lighters striking flame, and the crackle of coals mingled with the murmured chants of the condemned. Their prayers, carried on the morning air, were tentative, fragmentary, and ephemeral, swallowed immediately by the heat rising from the pyres. The atmosphere was dense, both materially and spiritually, as the city bore silent witness to the culmination of months of procedural orchestration, coercion, and narrative construction. The ritual of execution itself adhered to the rhythms of public spectacle and judicial finality. The condemned were led individually to their pyres, positioned to maximize visibility for the gathered spectators while minimizing their capacity for resistance. Each movement was choreographed, from the binding of hands to the positioning of robes and kindling. This ritualized preparation served multiple functions. It reinforced the authority of the crown, demonstrated the consequences of moral deviation as defined by the prevailing authorities, and symbolically erased the autonomy of the knights, reducing them to figures defined solely by their alleged crimes. The psychological impact on both the condemned and the witnesses was profound, creating an indelible memory that merged moral instruction with the spectacle of death. The flames, when finally ignited, consumed not only the material forms of the knights' robes, but also the symbolic remnants of resistance, discipline, and honor that had characterized their lives. Smoke rose into the Parisian sky, carrying with it the fragments of whispered prayers, the echoes of a brotherhood that had once spanned continents, and the residue of coerced confessions inked in dungeons far from the public eye. For the spectators, the conflation of ritual, punishment, and moral instruction created a narrative that aligned neatly with the accusations they had been told. The knights were sinners, morally and spiritually corrupt, and their fate was both just and inevitable. The pyres, in this sense, became both execution and theatrical assertion of authority, a physical manifestation of the mechanisms of control that had orchestrated their downfall. Even as the flames rose, there remained an invisible persistence of history and memory, the Templars' endurance in the face of systematic coercion, the moral compromises undertaken to preserve life, and the discipline that had defined their existence were obscured by the immediate visual narrative of punishment. Yet these elements persisted in subtle, intangible ways, in the meticulous construction of procession, the deliberate orchestration of spectacle, and the intersection of public perception with institutional authority. The execution was not merely a conclusion, it was a complex interplay of human endurance, narrative control, and societal expectation, leaving traces in collective memory that would shape historical interpretation for centuries. In the aftermath, the city of Paris absorbed the ritualized violence into its fabric. Streets that had carried the condemned now bore only faint echoes of footsteps and the lingering smell of smoke. The cathedral, a silent observer, retained the immovable permanence of stone against the transience of human life. The citizens returned to their routines, carrying the image of the pyres, the narrative of guilt, and the example of moral instruction into private and public memory. For the Templars, however, the consequences extended beyond mortality. The documentation, the coerced confessions, and the orchestrated public narrative ensured that their historical legacy would be dominated by allegations of depravity, heresy, and moral failure, allegations largely divorced from lived reality. Thus, the fires of Paris represented both an end and a transformation. The physical destruction of bodies was absolute, but the strategic orchestration of narrative, legal authority, and public perception ensured that the order's reputation would continue to exist, shaped by fear, coercion, and political expedience rather than the discipline and faith that had defined their existence. The pyres were the culmination of a process that had begun with whispers, arrests, and dungeons, and extended through coerced confessions, papal inquiries, and the careful alignment of moral and political authority. And as the smoke dissipated into the early morning sky, the stage was prepared for the next chapter, the dispersion of the order's remaining resources, the reassignment of lands and wealth, and the deliberate construction of historical narrative that would solidify the Templars' fall in both law and memory. From the ashes of the pyres emerged the next sequence of consequence, the systemic erasure and redistribution that marked the final acts in the orchestration of their disappearance from the centers of power. As the last flickers of the Templar pyres vanished into the Parisian dawn, the machinery of political and financial relocation moved with quiet precision. Lands, castles and revenue streams that had been under the stewardship of the Order were systematically inventoried, catalogued, and reassigned. The wealth of the Templars amassed over centuries through crusades, donations, banking, and the careful management of properties across Europe became a strategic instrument in the hands of King Philip IV. What had once been loans, obligations and debts owed to the Order now dissolved into the royal coffers, leaving behind not a trace of repayment, but the lingering shadow of violence and coercion that had made it possible. The process of confiscation was both bureaucratic and performative. Royal agents, clerics, and notaries moved from preceptory to preceptory, meticulously documenting holdings, assessing inventories, and transferring ownership. Seized properties were evaluated not only for their immediate material value, but also for their capacity to consolidate royal influence across France. Strategic castles, granaries, and trade routes were repurposed to extend the king's reach, while accumulated wealth, coin, precious metals, and stored goods was absorbed into treasuries that had once been indebted to the knights themselves. Each transfer was recorded with precision, leaving a paper trail that mirrored the earlier documentation of confessions, creating an administrative echo of the coercion that had preceded it. The eradication of Templar debts was not merely a financial maneuver, it was a moral and symbolic statement. By eliminating obligations owed to the Order, Philip IV transformed what had been relationships of trust, loan, and negotiation into instruments of power consolidation. Credit extended to the crown by the Templars, once a matter of contractual or fiduciary responsibility, was now rendered null by the sword, the pyre, and the instruments of fear. Debt in this context became a lens through which authority was exercised. The king had converted financial obligation into a demonstration of dominance, one paid for in blood and obedience rather than coin. The absorption of Templar wealth into royal coffers was accompanied by subtle mechanisms of secrecy and control. While inventories were maintained with bureaucratic rigor, the public narrative emphasized moral justification over financial gain. Chroniclers and clerics, often influenced by the crown, framed the confiscations as the legitimate consequences of heresy, sin, and divine judgment. The material transfer of assets was thus enveloped in a narrative of moral rectitude, masking the underlying strategy of political consolidation and personal enrichment. Citizens, witnessing both executions and redistributions, internalized a story of justice and divine intervention, even as the true mechanisms of power, coercion, document manipulation, and strategic violence operated behind the visible facade. The redistribution of wealth also had a profound impact on the remaining members of the Order. Knights who had survived imprisonment, recantation, or execution witnessed the dissolution of the structures that had defined their lives. Preceptories fell under royal or ecclesiastical control, financial networks collapsed or were absorbed into broader institutional frameworks, and the Order, once an autonomous entity with influence across Europe, ceased to function as a coherent organization. The transformation was both tangible and symbolic. The assets of the Templars, once sources of spiritual and martial power, became instruments of the crown, illustrating the intimate link between material wealth and the consolidation of authority. The erasure of debt also reveals the complex interplay between fear, coercion, and economics in medieval governance. By orchestrating confessions under duress, the king had created the moral and legal pretext to seize property. By manipulating the narrative of heresy and depravity, he neutralized opposition and minimized resistance. The combination of psychological pressure, coerced admission, and financial extraction demonstrates a calculated strategy in which human suffering was instrumentalized to achieve both political legitimacy and material gain. What appeared as punishment for sin was simultaneously the fulfillment of a sovereign's ambition, illustrating the inseparability of moral authority and temporal power in the medieval imagination. Across France, The consequences of these confiscations rippled through social, political, and economic networks. Noble families who had relied upon Templar loans now found themselves negotiating directly with the crown. Trade routes, fortified towns, and agricultural estates were reassigned, often with strategic intent to reinforce royal control. The dissolution of the order disrupted established financial and military networks, creating both opportunities for the monarchy and instability for local populations. In this sense, the erasure of debt was not a discrete event, but a transformative process that reshaped the landscape of power, commerce, and allegiance across the kingdom. The psychological impact on the broader public was equally significant. Observing the fall of a once powerful order, citizens, nobles, and clerics internalized a lesson about the alignment of moral and temporal authority. Confession, accusation, and execution were intertwined with financial extraction, creating a perception that obedience, moral compliance, and alignment with royal authority were inseparable. In this environment, power was reinforced not only through fear of punishment, but through the demonstration of tangible rewards and redistribution for those in favor, consolidating loyalty and discouraging dissent. Philip's treasury, swollen with the spoils of the order, became both a tool of governance and a symbol of absolute authority. The extraction of wealth, paired with the orchestration of confessions and public executions, illustrated a deliberate mastery over both human and material resources. The mechanisms of coercion, documentation, and legal formalization converged in a process in which survival, confession, and financial gain were inextricably linked. What had been obligations owed to a religious military institution now functioned as instruments of royal power, erasing debt while reinforcing the structures that allowed a king to dominate both land and people. Thus, the eradication of Templar debt was more than a matter of fiscal calculation. It was a culmination of coercive strategy, legal orchestration, and psychological manipulation. The crown's enrichment was inseparable from the suffering of the knights, the forced confessions, and the carefully constructed narrative of heresy. What was gained in treasure was inseparable from what was lost in honor, faith, and life. The erasure of debt stands as both a material achievement and a moral testament. Power had been asserted, resources secured, and history reshaped in the wake of human endurance and systematic manipulation. And as the royal coffers filled and the last preceptories were reassigned, the stage was set for the subsequent cultural and historical consequences of the Templars' fall. The myths, legends, and enduring misconceptions that would preserve their story long after their order had ceased to exist. From the erasure of debt and the accumulation of wealth emerged the next chapter, in which memory, narrative, and legacy would become instruments as potent as fire or steel. The year 1312 marked a decisive moment in the history of the Knights Templar. By papal decree, promulgated under the authority of Pope Clement V, the order that had once been a formidable presence across Europe, the Holy Land, and the Mediterranean, was formally dissolved. In the official documents, the language was careful, measured, and couched in theological and legal reasoning. The order was disbanded to prevent further scandal, to align with ecclesiastical concerns, and to protect the moral and spiritual order of Christendom. Yet the decree, no matter how meticulously phrased, could only operate upon what existed in parchment and ink. The dissolution erased the Templars' institutional presence in law and governance, but it could not erase the memories, experiences, or allegiances of the men who had lived within the brotherhood, nor the rumors and stories that had taken root across the lands they had once influenced. The bureaucratic mechanisms of dissolution were comprehensive. Templar preceptories, castles, and administrative centers were assessed, their properties inventoried, and their revenues redirected. Ecclesiastical authorities and royal officials oversaw the redistribution of lands to favored institutions or absorbed them directly into crowns and principalities. Documents detailing obligations, rents, and tithe collections were carefully archived, ensuring that the economic and legal footprint of the order could be traced even as the organization itself ceased to exist. Yet within these meticulously maintained records, the human dimension of the Templars' lives, their vows, their brotherhood, and the personal histories embedded within each preceptory was reduced to administrative abstraction, flattened into entries, figures, and formal pronouncements. The dissolution had both immediate and long-lasting social consequences. For the populations who had relied upon the Templars' services, whether as financial intermediaries, military protectors, or local administrators, the disappearance of the order introduced uncertainty. Trade routes previously safeguarded by Templar knights were left under less reliable protection. Agricultural estates lost their centralized management, sometimes falling into neglect or mismanagement under new administrators. Communities accustomed to the presence of the knights and their regulated systems of governance now faced the challenge of adjusting to the void created by the order's formal elimination. The ripple effects extended far beyond royal coffers and ecclesiastical records. They touched the lives of peasants, merchants, and nobility alike. Yet the dissolution could not entirely extinguish the Templars' influence, nor their presence in collective memory. Rumors of survival, whispered in taverns, market squares, and port cities, suggested that some knights had evaded capture, slipping past the king's guards or escaping the flames of execution. La Rochelle, the bustling Atlantic port, was said to have harbored ships laden with fleeing knights and treasures hastily spirited away from France. Tales spread of gold, silver, and sacred relics secreted in hidden chambers or sunken to the sea, guarded by a handful of faithful survivors who carried the secrets of the order forward in silence. These rumors, whether grounded in fact or nourished by imagination, contributed to an aura of mystery that would follow the Templars for centuries, blending history with legend. The narrative of disappearance was complicated by the nature of medieval record-keeping and the strategic use of documentation. While papal decrees, property transfers, and royal proclamations provided a sense of closure in law and official memory, the lived reality of individual knights remained largely invisible. Those who survived imprisonment, recantation, or exile could continue their lives under new identities, enter other monastic or military institutions, or disappear into the networks of Europe and the Mediterranean. Their voices, if they spoke at all, were muted by necessity, careful to avoid persecution, and their experiences seldom entered the official archives. In this way, the dissolution was total in institutional terms, but partial in human terms, erasing a structure without eradicating the individuals who had once animated it. The psychological and cultural effects of this disappearance were profound. Across Europe, chroniclers, clerics, and laypeople interpreted the dissolution as a moral and spiritual victory for the crown and the church. The narrative of heresy and depravity, carefully constructed through coerced confessions, interrogation, and public spectacle, provided the rationale for the order's elimination. Yet, as these events faded into history, the persistence of rumor, myth, and partial recollection kept the Templars alive in imagination. Legends of secret knowledge, hidden treasure, and clandestine brotherhoods emerged from the silences left by formal dissolution, creating a tension between recorded history and oral or folkloric memory. The mechanisms of control employed by Philip IV and the papacy during and after the dissolution were deliberate and meticulous. By regulating who could witness, document, and comment upon the order's remnants, authorities limited the possibility of organized resistance or public reconsideration of events. Testimonies of surviving knights were either suppressed or absorbed into legal and ecclesiastical processes that served the crown's narrative. The administration of the dissolution functioned as both an exercise in political efficiency and a performative assertion of authority, demonstrating the capacity of centralized power to erase institutions while simultaneously shaping collective memory to legitimize that erasure. The dissolution also served as a precedent in the exercise of authority over religious military orders. By demonstrating that even a powerful, well-connected, and wealthy organization could be neutralized through a combination of coercion, legal authority, and public narrative, Philip IV and Clement V established a model that would influence subsequent interactions between secular and ecclesiastical power. The balance of obedience, fear, and strategic narrative highlighted the vulnerabilities of institutions, illustrating the potency of coordinated political and religious intervention in shaping both immediate outcomes and long-term legacy. Despite the order's formal disappearance, the notion of Templar survival persisted in both contemporary accounts and later imagination. Stories circulated of knights fleeing to distant lands, of treasures hidden in monasteries or buried in remote forests, and of esoteric knowledge preserved in secrecy. These tales, grounded in fragments of truth yet amplified by conjecture and legend, contributed to the enduring mystique of the Templars, ensuring that even as their organizational presence was erased on parchment, their cultural and symbolic presence persisted. The order's dissolution was therefore a complex event, complete in law, partial in reality, and ambiguous in memory. And so, while the Knights Templar ceased to exist as a legally recognized entity, the consequences of their eradication continued to unfold. The redistribution of wealth, the suppression of testimony, and the orchestration of public perception ensured that the Crown and Church maintained control, yet the whispers of survivors, the traces of hidden treasure, and the resilience of memory meant that the story of the Templars could never be fully concluded. From this intersection of eradication and persistence arose the next chapter of consequence, the careful management of remaining narratives, the crafting of legend, and the cultivation of mystery that would allow the Templars' story to resonate across centuries, shaping imagination long after the order itself had vanished from law and land. For centuries, the story of the Knights Templar was told through the lens of scandal, accusation, and dramatic downfall. Their eradication had been meticulously documented by royal and ecclesiastical authorities alike, confessions inked under duress, properties reassigned, executions recorded with ceremonial precision. Yet beneath the layers of public record, hidden in the quiet and darkened recesses of the Vatican archives, lay evidence that would subtly, centuries later, challenge the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. Among these forgotten documents was the Chinon Parchment, a collection of letters and papal instructions preserved in relative obscurity, its significance obscured by time, politics, and the meticulous archiving practices of the Church. The parchment itself, composed of multiple sheets of parchment carefully folded and inscribed with clerical precision, bore the marks of secrecy and deliberation. Written in Latin, it contained the testimony of surviving Templar leaders who had been summoned to Avignon and interrogated under the supervision of papal legates. These testimonies recounted the ordeals of imprisonment, the confessions extracted under duress, and the complex web of coercion and fear that had dominated the prior decade. More importantly, the documents revealed that Pope Clement V, while navigating the political pressures of King Philip IV, had quietly absolved the Knights of heresy. The Church, in essence, recognized that the charges levied against the order had been shaped by coercion and human ambition, rather than by actual moral or doctrinal deviation. The Chinon Parchment provides insight not only into the legal absolution of the Templars, but also into the intricate politics of the time. Clement V, constrained by the demands of a powerful and indebted monarch, could not overtly counter the narrative promoted by the French crown without risking destabilization or conflict. Yet, through a series of secret absolutions, papal instructions, and careful documentation, the Church sought to reconcile spiritual truth with political reality. The absolution was conditional in its secrecy, intended to provide moral closure for the order, while avoiding direct confrontation with the king, whose ambitions had precipitated the arrests, interrogations, and executions. The document demonstrates the delicate balance between justice, diplomacy, and survival in a period when the lines between spiritual authority and temporal power were constantly negotiated. The testimonies recorded in the Chinon Parchment are remarkable for their clarity and their acknowledgement of human suffering. Knights describe their imprisonment, the conditions of interrogation, and the mechanisms of coercion that had compelled false confessions, They recounted the psychological and physical pressures exerted by royal agents, emphasizing that statements of heresy, idolatry, and moral corruption had been produced not out of genuine belief, but from the imperative of survival. The papal legates, tasked with evaluating these accounts, recognized the inherent unreliability of coerced testimony, distinguishing between acts imposed under duress and genuine moral or spiritual failing. This careful delineation highlights the Church's awareness of both human fragility and the potential for political manipulation in the administration of justice. The broader context of the Chinon Parchment underscores the tension between public perception and private acknowledgement. While the world outside the papal chambers continued to believe in the moral and spiritual corruption of the Templars, the Church in its hidden deliberations recognized that the accusations were largely unfounded. The discrepancy between public narrative and private truth reveals the power of narrative to shape history. Official proclamations, legal documents, and coerced confessions created a widely accepted story of heresy, while internal ecclesiastical acknowledgement quietly contradicted it. The Templars, although erased as an institution, had been morally vindicated, albeit in secrecy, their absolution hidden from the very populations that had been persuaded of their depravity. The discovery of the Chinon Parchment centuries later illustrates how historical truth can remain obscured, preserved only in the quietest corners of archival repositories. Its existence challenges assumptions about the Templars' guilt, providing concrete evidence that the Church had recognized the injustice imposed upon them. Historians examining the document note the care with which it was stored, folded, and annotated, reflecting both the sensitivity of its content and the desire to keep its revelations contained from political actors who might have reacted adversely. This hidden record demonstrates the duality of history. The events themselves were public and spectacular, yet the nuanced moral judgments of the Church remained invisible, locked in ink and parchment for generations to uncover. Moreover, the Chinon Parchment illuminates the complexity of memory, justice, and narrative in medieval Europe. It reveals that absolution, even when recorded, could be rendered ineffective in shaping public perception if the instruments of storytelling, chronicles, sermons, and official proclamations reinforced a different reality. The Templars' legacy, therefore, was caught between the formal moral recognition of innocence and the persistent cultural narrative of sin and heresy. This duality explains the enduring fascination with the order. They were simultaneously victims of manipulation and symbols of intrigue, condemned publicly while vindicated privately, their story oscillating between legend and historical record. The archival evidence also underscores the role of institutional authority in preserving or obscuring truth. By maintaining detailed records of interrogation, testimony, and absolution, the Church demonstrated an awareness of its responsibilities in both justice and documentation. Yet the choice to keep these absolutions secret reflects the pragmatic considerations of power. Public acknowledgement could provoke conflict with monarchs, disrupt political stability, or undermine other strategic objectives. The Templars' moral exoneration thus existed in a liminal space, formally recognized, but practically invisible, a shadow of truth that contrasted with the bright spectacle of accusation, trial, and execution that had defined their public image. In reading the Chinon Parchment, one perceives the tension between historical reality and imposed narrative. The Knights' confessions, extracted under duress, had created a narrative of depravity that served temporal and political ends, yet the Church's hidden recognition of innocence preserved the integrity of spiritual judgment. The juxtaposition of public condemnation and private absolution exemplifies the interplay between coercion, authority, and ethical evaluation, illustrating that historical truth can exist in forms both hidden and enduring, awaiting discovery by those willing to delve into the quiet recesses of archives and unexamined documents. Thus, the shadow in the archives represents a posthumous vindication for an order systematically destroyed in both flesh and institution. While public memory had been shaped by spectacle, coercion, and the manipulation of confession, the discovery of the Chinon Parchment centuries later revealed that the Church had quietly preserved a measure of justice. In this hidden record, the human dignity and moral standing of the Templars were acknowledged, even as their names had long been synonymous with scandal in popular imagination. And as this shadowed truth emerged from the archives, it set the stage for the next layer of the Templars' enduring legacy, the myths, speculation, and fascination that would grow around the order, blending fragments of historical reality with the allure of secret knowledge, lost treasure, and the persistence of human curiosity that refuses to let a story remain completely silenced. Long after the Templar Order had ceased to exist as a functioning institution, and centuries beyond the suppression, torture, and confiscation of their wealth, the memory of the Knights began to assume a form both larger and more enigmatic than their lived reality. From the ashes of coerced confessions, destroyed preceptories, and public executions, the imagination of Europe began to weave new narratives. The Templars, who had once been a disciplined and structured order devoted to both spiritual and martial pursuits, gradually transformed in popular consciousness into figures of extraordinary and often mysterious power. They became, in stories whispered in candlelit halls, libraries, and marketplaces, guardians of the Grail, keepers of relics forbidden by earthly authorities, and possessors of knowledge so arcane that only secrecy could preserve it. This transformation from historical actors to legendary figures was neither immediate nor uniform. The early decades after the dissolution witnessed a mix of rumor, skepticism, and selective memory. Chroniclers, often influenced by the crown, emphasized the narratives of heresy and punishment, while regional stories sometimes lingered on the bravery, skill, or wealth of the knights. Over time, however, as the original witnesses passed from memory and the Templars' deeds were filtered through centuries of retelling, the line between history and myth became increasingly porous. Facts, the Order's military campaigns, banking networks, and monastic structure merged seamlessly with inventions, secret rituals, hidden treasures, and mystical guardianship of sacred objects became standard elements in the evolving lore. The role of literature, folklore, and art in shaping this myth cannot be overstated. Writers and chroniclers, whether seeking to entertain, instruct, or moralize, amplified the aura of mystery surrounding the Order. The Templars' destruction, the secrecy of the Chinon Parchment, and the whispers of lost treasures at ports like La Rochelle provided fertile ground for narrative elaboration. Legends of the Holy Grail, for instance, intertwined with Templar history, suggesting that the knights, privy to sacred relics, had been unfairly punished to hide knowledge that might challenge prevailing religious or political authority. Similarly, the story of secret vaults filled with gold, precious relics, and esoteric manuscripts fed imaginations eager for tales of lost power and hidden wisdom. The Templars thus became archetypes of the concealed and the forbidden, their historical reality eclipsed by the grandeur and mystery of legend. The mythologization of the Templars was further enhanced by the natural human fascination with secret societies and concealed knowledge. In cultures across Europe, the idea of a hidden order, existing in shadows while influencing the course of history, captured imaginations and inspired speculation. The fact that the Templars had indeed operated across national boundaries, maintained financial networks, and controlled fortified locations only lent credence to these emerging legends. The Order's practical accomplishments were magnified in memory, filtered through centuries of storytelling, into a narrative of almost supernatural competence and influence. In this way, myth and reality coalesced, producing a Templar identity that was as much a product of imagination as it was of documented history. Artistic representation, too, played a crucial role in shaping public perception. Paintings, engravings, and illuminated manuscripts often depicted Templars as stoic, armored figures, standing resolute amid symbolic landscapes, flames, or relics of the Holy Land. These visual representations reinforced the narrative of the Templars as both heroic and secretive, bridging historical reality and mythic interpretation. Observers could witness the combination of martial prowess, spiritual dedication, and mysterious purpose, internalizing a version of the Templars that emphasized grandeur over mundane institutional detail. Over time, such representations influenced popular belief, embedding the Templars in cultural consciousness as figures whose presence seemed both tangible and enigmatic, real and allegorical. The accumulation of myth was also facilitated by the inherent gaps in historical record. While the Chinon Parchment provided evidence of absolution, much of the Templars' lived experience remained inaccessible. Preceptories had been destroyed, documents burned or hidden, and surviving knights dispersed into obscurity. These lacunae allowed storytellers, chroniclers, and later authors to fill the gaps with narrative invention. The interplay between lost records, official silences, and rumor created fertile ground for the construction of stories in which the Templars retained agency, knowledge, and power beyond what historical evidence could substantiate. The absence of comprehensive documentation was transformed into an opportunity for myth-making, allowing each successive generation to project its fantasies, fears, and ideals onto the Templar canvas. The mythic Templars also served as moral and symbolic touchstones. Their narrative offered a lens through which people could explore themes of loyalty, betrayal, spiritual devotion, and the corruption of authority. The Knights became emblematic of the tension between earthly power and moral integrity. Punished unjustly, yet morally resilient in secret, they embodied the enduring human fascination with clandestine virtue versus public misjudgment. This symbolic potency allowed their story to persist, reshaped across centuries, in ways that transcended the specifics of their historical deeds. The Templars' legend became a narrative resource, a mirror in which successive generations could see reflections of power, secrecy, and moral complexity. By the time the Renaissance and later Enlightenment arrived, the Templars were firmly ensconced in both cultural memory and speculative imagination. Historians, novelists, and poets could interpret their story in multiple ways, as a cautionary tale of political manipulation, as a chronicle of religious persecution, or as an adventure suffused with intrigue and secret knowledge. The endurance of their legend highlights the intersection of human curiosity, narrative gap, and symbolic resonance. Even as empirical historians worked to separate fact from fiction, the myths themselves persisted, demonstrating the inextricable bond between historical event and imaginative reconstruction. The legend of the Templars, therefore, became more powerful than the men themselves. The knights who had once lived within disciplined brotherhoods, who had endured dungeons, torture, and public disgrace, were gradually overshadowed by stories that ascribed to them capacities, knowledge, and influence that history could neither fully confirm nor deny. They became icons not only of religious and military history, but of human fascination with secrecy, lost knowledge, and moral complexity. In this transformation, the Templars' cultural presence outstripped their historical presence, a testament to the enduring power of narrative to outlive its subjects. And as myth solidified over centuries, it paved the way for the final layers of fascination, speculation regarding hidden treasures, secret manuscripts, and mysterious orders that might have survived beyond recorded history. From the foundation of legend, the next chapter emerges, a world in which the Templars are not merely historical actors but symbols, their narrative a bridge between reality, imagination, and the enduring human desire to uncover secrets that lie just beyond reach. The story of the Knights Templar, from their rise in the Holy Land to their spectacular fall in Europe, became more than a historical account. It evolved into a cautionary reflection on the mechanics of authority, the fragility of institutional trust, and the malleability of truth under duress. Centuries later, scholars, observers, and storytellers alike would examine the Templars' trajectory as a mirror, revealing patterns of human behavior that transcended specific political and religious contexts. Their downfall was not merely the eradication of a military and religious order, it was a study in the intersection of fear, power, and human vulnerability, a prism through which the consequences of coercion, political ambition, and social perception could be observed in quiet contemplation. At the center of this reflection is the understanding that fear, when systematically applied, can bend legal and moral structures to the will of those in authority. The Templars' arrests, interrogations, and public executions illustrate this dynamic with chilling clarity. King Philip IV, motivated by debt, envy, and the desire to consolidate power, wielded fear as a weapon against an institution whose obedience he could not fully command. By orchestrating arrests in the dead of night, leveraging legal and ecclesiastical authority, and employing torture as a tool of persuasion, he created an environment in which compliance could be compelled and truth could be manufactured. The mechanisms of fear were both psychological and structural, demonstrating how authority can manipulate institutions and individuals alike to achieve desired outcomes. The law in this context became both instrument and artifact. Legal proceedings, papal decrees, and inquisitorial processes were structured to appear legitimate, grounded in moral and religious reasoning. Yet the Templars' trials reveal the extent to which law can be reshaped under pressure, its principles subordinated to political expedience. Confessions extracted under duress were formalized, documented, and treated as evidence, transforming the narrative of false admission into an enduring historical record. In this manipulation, truth was not determined by objective reality, but by the alignment of statements with the expectations and objectives of those in power. The Templars' ordeal exemplifies how authority, when untempered by accountability or ethical restraint, can construct legal frameworks that appear just while serving strategic ends. Beyond law, their story demonstrates the fragility of truth itself under the influence of coercion. Knights who had dedicated their lives to vows of faith, discipline, and service were compelled to confess to acts they had never committed. Pain, isolation, and the threat of death blurred the boundary between reality and survival, producing statements that aligned with the expectations of their interrogators rather than with the facts of lived experience. These coerced confessions, once formalized and disseminated, became the foundation of historical narrative, illustrating how human endurance can be exploited to generate records of compliance, transgression, and moral failure. The lesson is enduring truth, even in societies structured by law and morality, can be contorted when the mechanisms of power are applied methodically and remorselessly. The redistribution of wealth and the appropriation of resources further underscore the interplay between power and perception. Confiscated properties, gold, and preceptories became tangible markers of authority, signaling the capacity of the monarchy to neutralize opposition and consolidate influence. What had been obligations and assets of the order were converted into instruments of control, demonstrating the intimate connection between material resources and political authority. Observers, both contemporary and future, could witness the alignment of coercion, law, and wealth as mutually reinforcing components of dominion, a lesson encoded not in abstract principle, but in concrete, visible outcomes. The Templars' fall also illuminates the human dimension of power, how the fear of suffering, the threat of pain, and the inevitability of mortality shape behavior and decision-making. Knights faced impossible choices, forced to balance honor against survival, conscience against coercion. Each confession, whether partially truthful or entirely manufactured, was a testament to human adaptability under extreme duress. In examining these dynamics, one recognizes the profound psychological consequences of concentrated power. When control is exercised through fear and manipulation, human behavior can be reshaped in ways that leave both ethical and historical reverberations. Moreover, the story of the Templars reveals the persistence of narrative control in shaping collective memory. The combination of coerced confessions, public executions, and bureaucratic documentation created a narrative of heresy and corruption that would endure long after the knights themselves were gone. Even centuries later, popular imagination, literary accounts, and artistic representation reinforced the perception of moral failure, demonstrating that power's influence extends beyond immediate action into the construction of long-term cultural memory. The lesson is stark. Historical interpretation, like truth itself, is vulnerable to manipulation when authority dictates the terms of what is recorded, disseminated, and preserved. The fall of the Templars thus serves as a study in the fragility of integrity under pressure. The knights, disciplined and devout, became instruments in a broader political strategy, their agency diminished, their voices constrained. Their coerced participation in a narrative they had not authored illustrates the human cost of centralized power applied without checks or ethical restraint. Observing this from a historical perspective, one discerns the repeated pattern across ages and cultures, institutions and individuals, no matter how strong or principled, are vulnerable when confronted with the convergence of fear, authority, and structural coercion. And yet, within this cautionary tableau, there is also a reflection of resilience. The enduring fascination with the Templars, the discovery of the Chinon Parchment, and the persistence of rumor and legend testify to the human capacity to seek truth, preserve memory, and question imposed narratives. Even in the shadow of manipulation and the apparatus of power, traces of authenticity, moral courage, and historical complexity survive, offering subsequent generations both evidence and reflection. The knights' experiences, though shaped by coercion, leave a legacy of inquiry, reminding observers that even under the most extreme conditions, human endurance and historical memory cannot be entirely extinguished. Thus, the downfall of the Templars becomes more than a story of medieval politics. It is a meditation on the interplay of fear, power, and truth. It illustrates how law can be contorted, confession manufactured, and public perception engineered to serve strategic ends. It also demonstrates that history is not merely a record of events, but a reflection of authority's capacity to shape memory, control narrative, and influence moral perception. Across centuries, the lesson resonates: power, unchecked and unexamined, can rewrite the story of even the most disciplined and revered institutions, yet the underlying reality, however obscured, persists beneath the surface, awaiting recognition. And as the echoes of their coerced confessions, extinguished preceptories, and redistributed wealth reverberated through history, the stage was set for the final contemplative chapters of the Templar legacy. The enduring questions of secrecy, hidden knowledge, and the persistent human fascination with a brotherhood whose existence, influence, and downfall continue to captivate the imagination long after their material presence vanished. The centuries that followed the destruction of the Knights Templar unfolded in quiet transformation. Time, in its steady erosion, softened the immediacy of their tragedy, but never erased the resonance of their name. What had once been a brotherhood of warriors and monks, erased from parchment and condemned in fire, began to live again, not through royal decree or papal absolution, but through the unyielding persistence of memory. Across Europe, the ashes of their demise settled into the soil of collective consciousness, and from that soil grew the long silence, an absence that spoke louder than accusation, a stillness in which history learned to whisper their story anew. For the medieval world, the Templars' end marked a rupture between faith and power that could never fully heal. Their name lingered in records, not as traitors or heretics, but as reminders of a fragile moral order, one in which loyalty to God could be undone by the ambitions of men. Yet even as their preceptories were dissolved, and their archives scattered, fragments of their existence persisted. Old seals lay buried in the walls of abbeys, faded ledgers gathered dust in monastic libraries, and the symbols once stitched into their mantles appeared carved into anonymous stones. These remnants did not shout, they merely waited. In villages once governed by their estates, people still spoke of the knights who had vanished. The elderly recounted tales of riders who never returned from Jerusalem, of ships seen departing La Rochelle under moonlight, of hidden vaults beneath the hills. The stories carried by generations blurred fact and imagination, yet each retelling kept alive a part of what history had tried to silence. The Templars, though officially erased, became spectral presences within Europe's imagination, men who had been wronged, whose vows had been turned against them, and whose memory refused to decay entirely. Meanwhile, in the centers of power that had destroyed them, silence took another form. Within the Vatican, papal records were sealed, their contents forgotten by most. guarded by archivists who knew their significance but rarely spoke of it. In France, the crown that had engineered their downfall continued to use their confiscated wealth to fortify its own strength, yet the moral debt of what had been done could never be repaid. Kings came and went, popes were crowned and buried, and still the shadow of the Templars lingered in the quiet corners of both church and state. It was as though their absence had become a kind of presence, a question without answer, a void that history could not comfortably fill. As Europe shifted through Renaissance and Reformation, the silence began to take on new meanings. Scholars, poring through decaying manuscripts, rediscovered fragments of Templar records. Humanist thinkers, fascinated by lost knowledge and secret wisdom, began to weave the Templars into a tapestry of forgotten truths. In this intellectual rebirth, the once condemned knights became subjects of inquiry, rather than objects of fear. Yet with each rediscovery came speculation. What had they known? What had they guarded? The silence surrounding their rituals, their symbols, and their supposed relics only deepened the intrigue. The lack of clarity invited invention. And so, legend grew in the spaces where evidence had been burned. Writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment began to recast the Templars as victims of tyranny, symbols of intellectual and spiritual freedom, crushed beneath the weight of absolutism. In France, as the monarchy faced its own revolutions, the Templar became a ghostly emblem of resistance against corrupt power. Their story, once one of condemnation, was repurposed as allegory: the innocent persecuted by authority, the loyal betrayed by the system they had served. The silence that had once been imposed upon them began to hum with subversion. Yet beyond symbolism and politics, the silence carried something more profound: the recognition that truth itself can vanish and yet endure, not in words but in echoes. The Templars' legacy became proof that memory, even when fractured and obscured, has its own way of surviving. Monastic scribes, curious antiquarians, and quiet archivists each played a role in ensuring that the story did not vanish entirely. By the 17th century, travelers exploring ancient ruins in the Holy Land or France would often find carvings of crosses and swords, sometimes attributed to forgotten knights. These discoveries, mundane in their reality, were transformed by imagination into evidence of a hidden brotherhood that had never truly died. It was in this period that the Templars' silence began to merge with the currents of myth. Secret societies that emerged in Europe, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and others, found in the memory of the Templars a lineage of mystery. They adopted symbols reminiscent of the old order, crafting rituals that echoed its structure and secrecy. Whether through genuine continuity or symbolic inheritance, the image of the Templar became a vessel for ideas that spanned centuries: faith bound to discipline, courage intertwined with sacrifice, knowledge hidden beneath the veil of persecution. The silence that had once been imposed by fear was now reclaimed as secrecy by choice, the transformation of tragedy into legend. Still, the true heart of their story lay not in hidden treasures or mystical orders, but in the quiet endurance of injustice remembered. The centuries that separated the world of the Templars from the modern age did not erase the human truth at its core: that power, when left unchecked, can destroy even the most devout. That faith, no matter how strong, can be exploited by those who seek control, and that silence, though forced, can become a form of defiance when it outlasts its oppressors. As Europe entered the modern era, the Templars were no longer regarded as heretics, but as enigmas, symbols of both purity and betrayal, faith and secrecy, order and destruction. Their story had been retold so many times that it transcended historical accuracy, becoming a reflection of humanity's search for justice and redemption. The fires that had consumed them had not destroyed their image, they had illuminated it, casting shadows that reached across the centuries. And as those flames faded into memory, they left behind a lingering glow, a light that illuminated the final quiet revelation of their story, where history and myth would merge completely. and the silence of the past would speak once more through the voices of those who sought to understand it. And as those flames faded into memory, they left behind a lingering glow, a light that illuminated the final, quiet revelation of their story, where history and myth would merge completely, and the silence of the past would speak once more through the voices of those who sought to understand it. In quiet reflection, the story of the Templars remains a warning that even in the halls of faith and justice, truth can be broken, and only time can piece it back together. Over 7 centuries have passed since the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, stood upon the scaffold before Notre Dame and proclaimed his innocence to the watching crowds. The river beside him reflected the orange light of the flames that would claim his life, yet beneath that terrible finality was an echo that has never truly ceased. The centuries transformed that echo into a reckoning, not of vengeance but of remembrance. History, when viewed through the long lens of time, has a way of restoring balance, even if imperfectly. The Church, once complicit in the persecution of the order, eventually recognized the distortion of justice that had occurred. The release of the Chinon Parchment in the early 21st century, confirming that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templars of heresy in secret, served as both revelation and quiet apology. It was a vindication that arrived too late for the men whose lives had been taken, but it allowed history to exhale, a soft, belated correction to centuries of misunderstanding. Yet even vindication cannot erase the moral weight of what transpired. The destruction of the Templars exposed a recurring truth that when fear and ambition intertwine, even sacred institutions can become instruments of cruelty. The Church that had once sent knights to defend the faith had, under pressure from a king, turned against its own defenders. The irony of that reversal remains one of history's most profound lessons, that power and piety, when combined without humility, can lead to devastation cloaked in righteousness. In the centuries that followed, the Templars' story became less about their actions and more about what they represented. Philosophers, historians, and theologians found in their downfall a reflection of every age's struggle with moral corruption and institutional decay. To some, they embodied faith betrayed by politics. To others, they symbolized the human capacity to endure, to be remembered despite deliberate erasure. In their absence, they became archetypes, martyrs of principle, cautionary examples of unchecked authority, and for some, spiritual ancestors in the eternal quest for justice. Their symbols, once burned and banned, found new life in unexpected places. The cross patty reappeared in coats of arms, military insignias, and even in the architecture of cathedrals rebuilt upon the ruins of older chapels. The idea of the knight, disciplined, faithful, and incorruptible, became the model for later chivalric orders, though none would ever quite recapture the austere mystery of the Templar ideal. Through literature, legend, and the romanticism of later centuries, they were reborn again and again, not as victims but as enduring guardians of forgotten truths. And perhaps that is the deepest form of reckoning, not the redressing of wrongs in a legal sense, but the restoration of dignity through memory. When humanity remembers injustice, even imperfectly, it ensures that the pattern is recognized when it re-emerges. The Templars' fall has been invoked in times of political repression, in debates over faith and reason, in every instance where conscience stands against authority. Their fate, though rooted in medieval soil, continues to bloom in the moral consciousness of later ages. Yet the reckoning is not theirs alone. It belongs also to those who judged them, to the systems that permitted their suffering, and to the countless generations who inherited the lesson without always understanding it. The church and monarchy that destroyed them would in time face their own reckonings, the Reformation for one, revolution for the other. The cycle of power and its undoing repeated itself, echoing the same principles that had once condemned the knights. Each iteration of history, in its quiet way, returned to the Templar example, as if drawn back to a moral compass buried beneath centuries of dust. In the modern era, the Templars occupy a strange and enduring space, both historical and mythological. They exist in the pages of scholarly works and the frames of popular fiction. Their symbols adorn museums, novels, and digital archives alike. the fascination persists not merely because of the mystery that surrounds them, but because their story speaks to something intrinsic in human nature, the yearning for justice, the allure of hidden truth, the belief that somewhere behind the curtain of power there lies a purity uncorrupted by greed or fear. The Templars, for all the complexity of their history, came to embody that hope, and so, in the long silence of history, they were never truly gone. Each rediscovery of a manuscript, each excavation of a forgotten chapel, each whispered legend about hidden treasure or secret lineage is less about gold or relics than about the search for meaning, the desire to connect with an age when ideals were paid for in blood and when truth, even when silenced, refused to die. The Templars' reckoning, therefore, is not confined to the past. It unfolds in every generation that revisits their memory, not as myth, but as meditation. Their story ends not with fire or confession, but with endurance, the endurance of truth through distortion, of memory through silence, of humanity through its own contradictions, and perhaps, in that endurance they achieved what they could not in life, immortality not of body, but of meaning. As night deepens and the centuries stretch out like a vast and silent sea, the memory of the Templars drifts upon the waters of time, steady, unbroken, eternal. Their voices may have been silenced by fear, their bodies consumed by flame, but their legacy glows still, quiet and unwavering, reminding all who listen that truth, though buried, never ceases to breathe.